The champagne glasses clinked, the laughter rose, and my family, the people who were supposed to love me, tore me apart in front of an entire 5-star restaurant. "Still a poor waitress," my father sneered, not even bothering to lower his voice. "I'm surprised they let you through the front door." My sister Tracy leaned in with that smile I'd known my whole life, the one that always came before she twisted the knife. "Maybe one day you'll afford a place like this, Danielle. Maybe." The other diners turned to watch. My mother laughed into her wine glass, and I sat there in my simple black dress saying nothing. They thought I was humiliated. They thought I was broken. They had no idea that in exactly 3 minutes, every cruel word would come back to haunt them. Because what my family didn't know, what they never bothered to find out during the 7 years they pretended I didn't exist, was that I didn't just work in hotels anymore. I owned them. 83 properties. $800 million. And the very restaurant where they were mocking me, it belonged to me. When the general manager approached our table and bowed before me saying, "Madam Chairwoman, the staff is ready for your tour," I watched the color drain from their faces. But that moment, that satisfying, delicious moment of shock, that was just the beginning. Because what happened next, the secrets that spilled out, the betrayals that surfaced, the confession that shattered everything I thought I knew about my own family, none of us were prepared for what that Christmas dinner would reveal. Stay with me. This story will be worth every second. My name is Danielle Webb, and I am 33 years old. I am the chairwoman of Masterson Hotels, one of the largest private hospitality companies in North America, though very few people know my face. For the past 14 years, I have built a life entirely separate from the family that once made me feel invisible, and I had convinced myself that chapter was permanently closed. Then the invitation arrived. It came on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, tucked inside an ivory envelope with elegant gold calligraphy spelling out my name. The return address stopped my heart cold. I recognized it immediately, even though I had spent 7 years trying to forget it existed. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, weighted with something more than paper. It carried the unmistakable scent of my mother's perfume, a fragrance I had not encountered since I was 19 years old, and walking out of their front door for the last time. What unsettled me most was not the invitation itself, but how it had found me. My private residence was exactly that private. I had purchased this townhouse through a series of shell companies specifically designed to keep my personal life separate from my professional identity. I never used this address for business correspondence. I never listed it anywhere public. Yet somehow my family had discovered where I lived. That single fact told me more than any words on the card ever could. They had been looking for me. They had invested time and resources into finding me, and that meant they wanted something. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment staring at the envelope without opening it. 7 years of silence. 7 years without a single phone call, birthday card, or holiday greeting. 7 years during which my own parents and sister pretended I had never existed. Now suddenly they wanted to reach out. The timing felt too deliberate to be coincidental. When I finally opened the envelope, I found a formal invitation printed on cream-colored cardstock. The language was polite, almost elegant, requesting my presence at a Christmas dinner at the Masterson Grand, one of the flagship properties in my own hotel chain. The irony was not lost on me. They had chosen my restaurant and my hotel to host whatever performance they were planning. Whether they knew that fact remained to be seen. The invitation mentioned celebrating Tracy's promotion to hotel management. My younger sister, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, had apparently climbed some corporate ladder and wanted the family together to witness her triumph. I read those words 3 times, searching for hidden meaning. Tracy had never once invited me to celebrate anything. When she graduated college, I learned about it through a mutual acquaintance. When she got engaged, then unengaged, I heard nothing at all. Our relationship had always been one-directional, with me giving and her taking until there was nothing left to give. The last time I spoke to anyone in my family was 7 years ago. Tracy had called asking to borrow $15,000 for what she described as an incredible business opportunity. I was 26 then, working my way up through Masterson Hotels, earning a respectable salary, but nowhere near wealthy. I told her I did not have that kind of money to spare. Her response was immediate and vicious. She called me jealous, selfish, and pathetic. When I tried to explain my financial situation, she hung up on me. 3 days later, my father called. I remember that conversation with perfect clarity because it was the last time I heard his voice. He did not ask for my side of the story. He did not care about my perspective. He simply told me I was dead to them. He said I had always been a disappointment, that I had never contributed anything to the family, and that they were better off without me. Then he told me never to contact them again and ended the call. I honored that request. For 7 years, I built my career in silence. I rose from regional director to vice president to the position I now hold. I became one of the most influential women in hospitality, all while my family apparently believed I was still struggling somewhere, probably waiting tables, probably failing at life. They never bothered to check. They never wondered what happened to the daughter and sister they had discarded like yesterday's newspaper. And now they wanted to celebrate Tracy's promotion. I did not sleep well for 3 nights after receiving that invitation. I lay awake replaying old memories, old wounds, old moments when I had tried so desperately to earn approval that never came. I thought about the birthdays, they forgot the achievements. They ignored the constant comparisons to Tracy that made me feel like a stranger in my own home. I thought about my mother's disappointed sighs, and my father's dismissive waves, and my sister's cruel smiles. I thought about all of it, and I felt the old familiar ache in my chest that I thought I had buried years ago. But I also felt something else. I felt strong. I felt curious. And I felt perhaps for the first time like I was ready to face them from a position of power rather than weakness. I decided to accept the invitation, not because I harbored any illusion of reconciliation. That fantasy died the night my father called me dead to them. I accepted because I needed to understand what they wanted. I accepted because I refused to spend another decade wondering what might have happened if I had shown up. And I accepted because some part of me, some stubborn part, that had survived every dismissal and every cruelty wanted them to see who I had become. Whatever game they were playing, I was no longer the powerless girl they remembered. I had built an empire from nothing. I had earned respect from people who actually mattered. And I had learned through years of hard experience that knowledge is the ultimate form of protection. I wrote my response on personal stationery, keeping the message brief and neutral. I confirmed my attendance without enthusiasm or emotion. I gave nothing away. As I sealed the envelope, I read my father's words one more time. "We would love for you to celebrate Tracy's big promotion." The phrasing felt rehearsed, almost corporate in its detachment. This was not a family reaching out in love. This was a family reaching out in need. I did not yet know what they needed or why they had chosen this moment to break 7 years of silence. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This invitation was not about celebration at all. After I mailed my response to the invitation, I found myself unable to escape the past. It crept back into my thoughts uninvited, filling the quiet hours with memories I had spent years trying to bury. The invitation had torn open something I thought had healed, and now the old wounds bled fresh. I sat alone in my living room that evening, watching the snow fall outside my window, and I let myself remember what it felt like to grow up invisible in my own home. I was never supposed to be the forgotten daughter. I did everything right. I earned straight A's from elementary school through high school. I started working part-time at 14, bagging groceries and later waitressing because I understood instinctively that asking my parents for money would only lead to disappointment. I never caused trouble, never stayed out late, never gave them a single reason to worry. I was responsible, dependable, and utterly unremarkable in their eyes. No matter what I achieved, their attention always drifted past me like I was furniture they had stopped noticing long ago. Tracy was different. Tracy was the sun around which our entire family orbited. She was 2 years younger than me, born with blonde curls and a natural charm that made adults coo over her from infancy. I do not blame her for being lovable. What I blame is the system our parents created, the unspoken hierarchy that placed her at the center of everything while I existed somewhere in the margins. Tracy could bring home a report card full of C's and receive praise for trying her best. I could bring home straight A's and receive nothing but silence. Tracy could throw tantrums in public and be comforted. I could stand quietly in the background and be forgotten entirely. The favoritism was not subtle. It was woven into the fabric of our daily lives, so consistent and pervasive that I eventually stopped questioning it. I simply accepted that this was how things were. Tracy received elaborate birthday parties with themes and decorations and guest lists that required weeks of planning. My birthdays were afterthoughts acknowledged with a store-bought cake. If I was lucky, sometimes forgotten altogether. I remember turning 12 and waiting all day for someone to mention it. No one did. When I finally said something at dinner, my mother looked startled and apologized, explaining that she had been so busy planning Tracy's upcoming dance recital that it had slipped her mind. Tracy was 10. Her recital was 3 weeks away, and somehow that mattered more than her older daughter turning 12. I learned to stop expecting acknowledgement. I learned to celebrate my own accomplishments quietly internally, without seeking validation from people who would never provide it. When I made the honor roll, I told no one. When I won a writing contest in 9th grade, I hid the certificate in my closet. Sharing good news only highlighted how little my family cared, and the silence that followed felt worse than not sharing at all. The memory that haunts me most happened when I was 16. I had discovered a scholarship opportunity, a prestigious program that could have changed my entire future. The application required a parent's signature and a personal essay about my goals. I spent 2 weeks perfecting that essay, pouring my dreams onto paper with more vulnerability than I had ever allowed myself. When I finished, I brought the application to my mother, hoping she might read it, might for once see who I really was and what I wanted from life. She was sitting at the kitchen table helping Tracy with homework. I stood in the doorway, holding my application, waiting for a pause in their conversation. Tracy was struggling with basic algebra, and my mother was patiently explaining the same concept over and over. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. I shifted my weight from foot to foot, cleared my throat, gently did everything I could to signal my presence without interrupting. My mother never looked up, not once. After 40 minutes of standing there watching her devote complete attention to Tracy's mediocre homework while I held my future in my hands, I finally walked away. I signed the application myself, forging her signature, and mailed it without ever mentioning it again. I did not receive that scholarship. I have always wondered if having a real parent's involvement might have made a difference. As we grew older, the favoritism calcified into something crueler. I became the household workhorse, while Tracy became the household princess. I was expected to clean, cook, do laundry, and maintain the house, while Tracy was excused from chores because she needed to focus on her social life. I worked after school and on weekends, contributing a portion of every paycheck to family expenses because my father insisted I needed to learn responsibility. Tracy received a generous allowance for shopping, movies, and whatever else she desired, funded by money that apparently materialized from nowhere. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but pointing it out only resulted in lectures about gratitude and family duty. I sacrificed countless weekends helping Tracy with school projects she had procrastinated on, writing essays she would submit under her own name, solving math problems she never bothered to learn. I did this because refusing meant enduring my mother's disappointment and my father's cold anger. I did this because the alternative was conflict, and conflict in my family always ended the same way, with me being told I was selfish, difficult, or ungrateful. It was easier to comply. It was easier to disappear into usefulness than to fight for recognition I would never receive. The phrase that defined my childhood came from my mother, repeated so often it felt like a family motto. Whenever I questioned the imbalance, whenever I dared to suggest that perhaps Tracy could handle her own responsibilities, my mother would sigh and deliver the same response. "You have to give way to Tracy. She has a future ahead of her. You will manage somehow." Those words carved themselves into my soul, shaping my understanding of my own worth. Tracy had a future. I would merely manage. Tracy was destined for something. I was destined for nothing in particular. I believed her for years. I internalized the message that I was less valuable, less important, less worthy of investment or attention. I moved through my teenage years like a ghost in my own home, present but unnoticed, contributing but unappreciated. I told myself this was normal, that all families had dynamics like this, that I was probably being oversensitive. It took me a long time to understand that what I experienced was not normal at all. It was systematic diminishment, a slow and steady erosion of my sense of self. On the night before I left home forever, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and whispered to myself the truth I had been avoiding for 18 years. Maybe I was never meant to belong. The words felt like surrender, like finally accepting a verdict that had been handed down long ago. I did not cry. I had stopped crying about my family years earlier. I simply looked at my reflection and acknowledged what I had always known. I had no idea in that moment what fate had already set in motion. The whisper I made to myself that night proved prophetic, though not in the way I expected. I did not belong in that house, but the universe had other plans for where I would eventually find my place. The breaking point came 6 months after that moment in front of the mirror, and when it arrived, it shattered whatever fragile connection still remained between me and the family that had never truly claimed me. I was 19 years old when Tracy decided to become an entrepreneur. She had graduated high school with mediocre grades and no clear direction, but she possessed the one quality our parents valued above all others. She was Tracy. When she announced her intention to start a boutique clothing business, our parents responded with enthusiasm I had never seen them direct toward any of my accomplishments. They believed in her completely, despite the fact that Tracy had never demonstrated business acumen, financial responsibility, or even basic follow-through on any project she had ever started. Their faith was blind and absolute, rooted not in evidence, but in the unshakable conviction that their golden child was destined for greatness. They funded her venture with $15,000 money they borrowed against the house because their savings had long since evaporated. I learned about this loan only after the fact, when the business had already failed spectacularly. Tracy had spent the money on inventory. She could not sell a storefront lease she could not afford, and personal expenses she disguised as business costs. Within 4 months, every dollar was gone. The boutique closed before it ever truly opened, leaving behind nothing but debt and a collection of unsold merchandise that would eventually be donated to charity. I expected my parents to be devastated. I expected them to finally see Tracy for who she really was, a charming but irresponsible young woman who had squandered their trust and their money. I expected, perhaps naively, that this failure might recalibrate the family dynamic, might force them to acknowledge that Tracy was not the infallible princess they had always believed her to be. Instead, they turned their anger toward me. The confrontation happened on a Sunday evening in late spring. I had just returned from a double shift at the restaurant where I worked, exhausted and looking forward to nothing more than a shower and sleep. My parents were waiting for me in the living room, their expressions grim. Tracy sat on the couch crying softly into a tissue, playing the victim with practiced perfection. I knew immediately that something terrible was about to happen. My father spoke first. He explained that the family was in financial trouble, that the loan needed to be repaid, and that sacrifices would have to be made. Then he looked directly at me and said the words that would end my relationship with my family forever. He told me I needed to withdraw my college savings, the money I had earned through years of part-time work and careful budgeting, and give it to them to help cover Tracy's debt. I remember the silence that followed his demand. I remember the way my heart pounded in my chest, the way my hands trembled at my sides. I had saved nearly $3,000 for college, every penny earned, through my own labor, sacrificed weekends and social opportunities and sleep. That money represented my future, my escape, my proof that I could build something for myself despite everything working against me. And now they wanted me to surrender it to clean up Tracy's mess. I said no. The word came out stronger than I expected, clear and definitive, in a way I had never been with my family before. I told them I would not give up my savings to pay for Tracy's mistakes. I told them it was not fair to ask me to sacrifice my future because Tracy had been reckless with theirs. I told them for the first time in my life that I mattered too. My father's response was immediate and brutal. He called me useless. He called me selfish. He called me a waste of space who had never contributed anything meaningful to the family. His voice rose to a shout as he cataloged my failures, my inadequacies, my fundamental worthlessness as a daughter and a human being. Years of suppressed resentment poured out of him, and I realized in that moment that he had never loved me at all. I had been tolerated, not cherished. I had been used, not valued. When he finally stopped shouting, my mother added her own quiet condemnation. She looked at me with disappointment so profound it seemed to age her face, and she said simply that they should have known I would never help this family. The words were soft, but they cut deeper than my father's screaming. My mother, the woman who had given birth to me, who had raised me, who was supposed to love me unconditionally, had just confirmed what I had always feared. In her eyes, I was not family. I was merely a resource that had failed to perform as expected. I went to my room without another word. I moved mechanically, operating on autopilot, my emotions too overwhelming to process in real time. I pulled a duffel bag from my closet and began to pack. A few changes of clothes, my birth certificate and social security card, a photograph of my grandmother, the only relative who had ever shown me genuine affection. I counted the cash in my wallet and found $62, everything I had left, after years of contributing to family expenses. $62 to start a new life. It seemed impossible, but staying seemed worse. I wrote a note and left it on my pillow. 5 words that contained no anger, no accusation, no plea for reconciliation. I hope you find happiness. I meant it sincerely. Whatever dysfunction had created this family, whatever wounds my parents carried that made them capable of treating their own child this way, I hoped they would someday find peace. I simply could not be part of their journey toward it. I walked down the hallway for the last time, my footsteps quiet on the worn carpet. I passed Tracy's room where light glowed beneath the door and music played softly. I passed my parents' room where I heard the low murmur of conversation, probably discussing what to do about their financial problems now that I had refused to solve them. I reached the front door, turned the handle and stepped outside into the cool night air. No one came after me. No one called my name. No one opened a window to ask where I was going or when I would return. The door clicked shut behind me with a sound of terrible finality, and the silence that followed hurt more than any words my father had screamed. I stood on the porch for a long moment, waiting for something, for someone, for any indication that my departure mattered to anyone inside that house. Nothing came. I was truly and completely alone. The Greyhound station was a 2-mile walk through dark streets. I made it in 30 minutes, my duffel bag bouncing against my hip, my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. I bought a one-way ticket to Denver with most of my remaining money and found a seat on a bus that smelled like diesel fuel and desperation. As the engine rumbled to life and the station began to slide away behind us, I pressed my forehead against the cold window and watched the city lights fade into darkness. I felt terror unlike anything I had ever experienced. I was 19 years old, with $62 and no plan, heading toward a city where I knew no one and had nothing waiting for me. The rational part of my mind screamed that I was making a catastrophic mistake, that I should get off at the next stop and go home and apologize and accept whatever punishment my parents deemed appropriate. But I also felt something else beneath the terror. I felt free. For the first time in my life, no one was watching me with disappointment. No one was comparing me to Tracy. No one was reminding me of my inadequacy. I was anonymous, invisible in a new way, a way that felt like possibility rather than erasure. I made a vow to myself as the miles accumulated behind me. I would build a life so solid that no one could ever make me feel worthless again. I would become someone who mattered not to my family, but to myself. I would prove that the forgotten daughter had value, even if the only person who needed convincing was me. That night, exhausted and terrified, on a Greyhound bus heading toward an uncertain future, I did not know that I had just stepped onto the path that would make me unstoppable. The path began in a place no one would have expected to produce a future chairwoman. When the Greyhound bus deposited me in Denver, I had $43 remaining after buying food during the journey, no place to sleep, and no idea what I was going to do next. The first week was a blur of park benches and public libraries, of stretching every dollar until it screamed of learning that pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. I applied for every job I could find, filling out applications at fast food restaurants and grocery stores and anywhere else that might pay me enough to survive. Most places never called back. The few that did took one look at my lack of local references and my obvious desperation and decided I was not worth the risk. The diner found me before I found it. I was walking through a rough neighborhood on the outskirts of downtown, searching for a cheap motel that might rent by the week, when I noticed a handwritten sign taped to a grease-smeared window. "Help," wanted it said. "Inquire within." The place was called Lucky's, though nothing about it seemed particularly fortunate. It was a 24-hour establishment that catered to truck drivers, night shift workers, and people who had nowhere else to go at 3 a.m. The linoleum floors were cracked, the booths were patched with duct tape, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with a frequency that would eventually become the soundtrack of my dreams. I walked in and asked for the manager. 30 minutes later, I had a job. The pay was minimum wage, plus tips. The hours were whatever shifts no one else wanted, and the work was harder than anything I had ever done. But I was employed. I was going to survive. Those first months at Lucky's taught me more than any classroom ever could. The work was brutal in ways I had not anticipated. I served drunk customers who grabbed at me when I walked past their tables. I cleaned up vomit from bathroom floors and sometimes from the dining area itself. I learned to smile at men who made comments about my body, to deflect their advances without escalating the situation to protect myself while still earning the tips I desperately needed. I worked double shifts that left my feet aching so badly I could barely walk home. I dropped into bed exhausted and woke up exhausted, then did it all again because the alternative was homelessness and hunger. But I never complained. Not once. Complaining required energy I did not have, and more importantly, it served no purpose. The conditions at Lucky's were not going to change because a 19-year-old waitress was unhappy. The only thing I could change was myself, my skills, my ability to navigate an environment that seemed designed to break people down. So instead of complaining, I observed. I studied. I learned. Every shift taught me something valuable. I learned how to read customers the moment they walked through the door, to assess their mood, and adjust my approach accordingly. A tired trucker wanted efficiency and minimal conversation. A lonely night worker wanted someone to listen. A group of rowdy young men wanted to feel important, and if I could make them feel that way without compromising my dignity, they would leave generous tips and behave themselves. I learned to stay calm when customers screamed at me over cold coffee or slow service. I learned that anger directed at a waitress was rarely about the waitress at all. People were fighting battles I could not see, carrying wounds I could not heal, and sometimes the best I could do was absorb their frustration without taking it personally. I became skilled at turning hostile situations into positive outcomes. A customer who started the meal furious often left satisfied if I acknowledged their complaint, sincerely offered a solution promptly, and followed up to ensure they were happy. These were not revolutionary techniques, but executing them consistently under pressure required discipline and emotional control that most people never developed. I was developing them out of necessity, forging capabilities I did not yet understand would become the foundation of everything I would later build. What set me apart from the other waitresses was a small notebook I carried in my apron pocket. I bought it at a dollar store during my second week at Lucky's, a cheap, spiral-bound pad with a faded blue cover. In that notebook, I recorded everything. I wrote down how the manager handled complaints, which approaches worked, and which made things worse. I documented how the kitchen communicated with the floor where the bottlenecks occurred during rush periods, why certain systems created chaos, while others maintained order. I analyzed why some menu promotions succeeded while others failed, noting the language used on the signs, the pricing strategies, the timing of their introduction. The other waitresses noticed my constant note-taking and found it amusing. They called it my little notebook with affectionate condescension, assuming I was writing poetry or keeping a diary or engaging in some other harmless eccentricity. None of them understood what I was actually doing. I was treating Lucky's Diner as my university, extracting every possible lesson from an environment most people wanted only to escape. I was building a knowledge base that no one could take from me, accumulating observations and insights that would compound over time into something valuable. I did not know exactly what I was building toward. I only knew that knowledge was power, and I had been powerless long enough. The night that changed my life seemed ordinary when it began. It was past midnight, the dead hours, when Lucky's attracted its strangest clientele, and I was working the counter alone while my coworker took her break. An elderly gentleman entered and took a seat at the far end of the counter, away from the other customers. He wore an expensive suit that looked wildly out of place in our shabby diner, and he ordered only coffee, which he sipped slowly, while observing the room with sharp, attentive eyes. I noticed him noticing things. The way his gaze tracked the flow of customers, the movement of staff, the small inefficiencies that I had documented in my notebook. He was studying the diner the same way I studied it, with the analytical eye of someone who understood operations and systems. I found this curious, but had no time to dwell on it because a table of rowdy customers was demanding my attention. The group consisted of 4 young men who had clearly been drinking before arriving. They were loud, obnoxious, and determined to make my night difficult. One of them complained that his burger was overcooked. Another insisted his coffee was cold, despite the steam rising visibly from the cup. A third made inappropriate comments about my appearance, while his friends laughed. The situation was escalating toward the kind of confrontation that could get ugly fast. I handled it the way I had learned to handle such situations. I apologized sincerely for the burger, offered to have it remade immediately, and brought fresh coffee without arguing about the temperature of the original cup. I redirected the inappropriate comments with humor that diffused tension without encouraging further behavior. I made them feel heard without making myself a target. Within 15 minutes, the table had transformed from hostile to friendly. They left a $20 tip on a $30 check, shaking my hand and apologizing for their earlier rudeness. When I returned to this counter to refill the elderly gentleman's coffee, he looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. He was quiet for a long moment, then spoke in a voice that carried the weight of authority and experience. "You are far too sharp for a place like this," he said. Before I could respond, he placed a $100 bill on the counter beside his empty cup. On top of the bill sat a business card. He nodded once, then stood and walked out into the night without another word. I picked up the card with trembling hands. The paper was thick and expensive, embossed with elegant lettering. Walter Masterson, it read, Chairman, Masterson Hotels. I stared at that card for a long time, my hands shaking, my mind racing with possibilities I could not yet comprehend. I did not know who Walter Masterson was. I did not know that Masterson Hotels was one of the largest private hospitality companies in the country. I did not know that this stranger had just handed me the key to a future beyond anything I had ever imagined. All I knew was that someone had finally seen me. The business card sat on my nightstand for 2 weeks before I found the courage to use it. Every night after my shift at Lucky's, I would pick it up and trace the embossed letters with my fingertip, imagining what might happen if I actually called. Most nights I convinced myself it would be pointless. A man like Walter Masterson probably handed out business cards to dozens of people. He had likely forgotten me the moment he walked out of that diner. Calling would only confirm what my family had always told me, that I was nobody special, that my ambitions exceeded my abilities, that I should know my place and stay in it. But something kept pulling me back to that card. Maybe it was the way he had looked at me with genuine recognition rather than dismissal. Maybe it was the $100 tip, more money than I typically earned in a week. Maybe it was simply desperation, the understanding that I could not waitress at Lucky's forever, and that opportunities like this one might never come again. Whatever the reason, I finally picked up the phone on a Tuesday morning and dialed the number before I could talk myself out of it. I expected to navigate through layers of secretaries and assistants. I expected to leave a message that would never be returned. I expected rejection in one form or another, because rejection was what I had been trained to expect. Instead, Walter Masterson answered on the third ring. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, measured and authoritative, but not unkind. When I identified myself as the waitress from the diner, he responded immediately. "I was wondering when you would call," he said. "I was beginning to think you might not." There was something in his tone that suggested he had been waiting, perhaps even hoping. The realization stunned me into momentary silence. He invited me to meet him for coffee the following afternoon at a hotel I had never heard of, but which turned out to be one of the flagship properties in his chain. I arrived 30 minutes early, too nervous to risk being late, and spent the extra time observing the lobby. Everything about the place spoke of understated elegance, the quality of the furniture, the attentiveness of the staff, the way the space flowed naturally from entrance to front desk to seating areas. I found myself mentally cataloging details, noting what worked and what could be improved, treating the hotel the same way I treated Lucky's Diner. Old habits, it seemed, died hard. Walter arrived precisely on time and led me to a quiet corner where we could talk without interruption. What followed was less a conversation than an interrogation, though conducted with such warmth that I never felt defensive. He asked me about the diner, what I had observed, what I would change if given the authority, why certain things functioned well while others created problems. His questions were sharp and specific, probing not just what I knew, but how I thought. I answered as honestly as I could, drawing on the notes I had accumulated in my little notebook over months of careful observation. When I finished explaining my theory about why the diner's lunch rush was consistently chaotic while dinner service ran smoothly, Walter leaned back in his chair and regarded me with an expression I could not quite interpret. "You see what others miss," he said finally. "That kind of perception is not teachable. It is rare and it is valuable." Then he offered me a position in Masterson Hotel's management trainee program, a competitive opportunity that typically required a college degree and industry connections I did not possess. I accepted before he finished describing the salary. I learned more about Walter Masterson over the following months, piecing together his story from company materials and conversations with colleagues. He was a legend in the hospitality industry, a self-made billionaire who had built his empire from a single roadside motel he purchased at age 25 with borrowed money. Through decades of strategic expansion and relentless attention to quality, he had grown that single property into a chain of 83 hotels across North America. Masterson Hotels remained a private company deliberately kept out of public markets to preserve Walter's vision and independence. He personally owned 78% of the shares, making him one of the wealthiest men in the industry and answerable to no one but himself. What I did not learn until much later was why Walter had taken such immediate interest in me. He had no children of his own. His wife had passed away from cancer 15 years earlier, and he had never remarried. The company was his legacy, but he had no heir to inherit it. He had been searching quietly and patiently for someone worthy of carrying forward what he had built. But there was another reason, one he kept hidden from me for years. Walter recognized my surname the moment I introduced myself: Webb. 20 years earlier, a real estate broker named Richard Webb had swindled Walter in a property deal, forging documents and manipulating contracts to pocket a substantial commission. The betrayal had nearly bankrupted Walter during a vulnerable period of expansion. He had sued one and watched Richard Webb lose his broker's license and reputation. But he had never forgotten the name, and he had quietly investigated the Webb family in the years since, curious about what kind of people could produce such a dishonest man. When Walter saw me handling those difficult customers at the diner, when he observed my work ethic and my analytical mind, he recognized something unexpected. The family that had produced Richard Webb had also produced me. The same soil that grew poison had somehow also grown something worthwhile. He decided to invest in me, not despite my surname, but partly because of it, seeing an opportunity to prove that people were more than their origins, that talent and character could emerge from even the most unpromising circumstances. Over the next year, Walter became the father I had never had. He was demanding in ways my biological father had never been, holding me to standards so high I sometimes thought I would break under the pressure. But he was also fair, acknowledging my successes as readily as he corrected my failures, treating me with a respect I had never experienced from a parental figure. He pushed me harder than any other trainee in the program, assigning me to the most challenging properties, the most difficult situations, the problems that more experienced managers had failed to solve. When I succeeded, he raised the bar. When I struggled, he taught me what I needed to learn. He protected me from office politics and petty jealousies, shielding me from colleagues who resented my rapid advancement while never allowing me to become complacent. I learned everything under his guidance: accounting and financial management, operations and logistics, guest relations and customer service excellence, crisis management and media communications, strategic planning, and competitive analysis. I absorbed knowledge like a sponge, filling in the gaps left by my lack of formal education with practical experience and Walter's decades of accumulated wisdom. The notebook I had started at Lucky's grew into a library of insights, each lesson building upon the last. One evening, after I successfully managed a public relations disaster at one of our properties, navigating a situation that could have damaged the brand irreparably, Walter invited me to dinner. Over dessert, he looked at me with an expression that combined pride and something else I could not identify. One day he said quietly, "You will run something far bigger than any hotel I own." I laughed and deflected the compliment, assuming he was simply being encouraging. I did not understand that Walter Masterson never said anything he did not mean. He harbored a secret about my father, a truth connecting our families that extended beyond business transactions and legal disputes. He would not reveal it until he believed I was strong enough to hear it. The secret Walter kept from me was not the only truth hidden during those years of my transformation. While I was building my career and discovering my potential, my family was experiencing a very different trajectory. I learned the details much later, after everything had unraveled and the full picture finally came into focus. What I discovered explained so much about why they had reached out after 7 years of silence, and it erased any lingering doubt about their motivations. My father's decline began long before I left home, though I had not understood its origins at the time. Richard Webb had been a real estate broker in his younger years, moderately successful, and perpetually convinced that his next big deal was just around the corner. What I never knew, what he never told anyone in the family, was that his career had ended not through bad luck, but through scandal. 20 years before I met Walter Masterson at that diner counter, my father had swindled him in a property transaction. He had forged documents, manipulated contracts, and pocketed money that did not belong to him. When Walter discovered the fraud, he pursued legal action with the relentless determination that had built his hotel empire. My father lost the lawsuit, lost his broker's license, and lost any chance of working in real estate again. But Richard Webb never accepted responsibility for his downfall. In the narrative he constructed for our family, he was the victim of corrupt competitors and an unfair system. Bad luck had pursued him relentlessly. The economy had turned against him at the worst possible moment. Other brokers had stolen his clients through underhanded tactics. He had 1,000 explanations for his failure, and none of them involved his own choices. This pattern of deflection defined everything about how he operated. Nothing was ever his fault, and someone else was always to blame. After losing his license, my father drifted through a series of unsuccessful ventures and low-paying jobs. The family survived on credit cards, each balance transferred to the next, when payments became unmanageable. They took out a second mortgage on the house, then a third. They borrowed from relatives until the relatives stopped answering their calls. Through all of this, Tracy remained the family's hope for stability. She had graduated from college with a degree in business administration funded by student loans. My parents co-signed with no intention of helping repay, and she had eventually landed a management position at a hotel in our hometown. The irony of Tracy's employment was something I would only appreciate later. The hotel she managed was part of the Masterson chain, one of 83 properties in the empire I was helping to build. Tracy never bothered to research the parent company or learn anything about the corporate structure above her. She was incurious about such details, focused entirely on her own immediate sphere of influence and the image she projected to those around her. She had no idea that her sister, the one she had dismissed as worthless, was rising through the ranks of the very organization that signed her paychecks. Tracy's management style was catastrophic. I learned this through internal reports that crossed my desk years later, documents that painted a damning picture of incompetence and misconduct. She had embezzled funds from the marketing budget, diverting money intended for advertising into personal accounts she thought no one would notice. She bullied employees with such consistency that turnover at her property was triple the company average. Good workers quit rather than endure her abuse. Those who remained learned to keep their heads down and say nothing. She falsified performance reports to hide the declining metrics, creating fictional successes to present to regional supervisors who were too overworked to verify her claims. Human resources complaints accumulated in her file like sediment layers in geological time, each one documenting another instance of harassment or misconduct. Tracy remained oblivious to the danger she was in, convinced that her charm and her excuses would protect her indefinitely. She lived far beyond her means, financing a lifestyle of expensive clothes and frequent vacations through credit cards and loans she had no ability to repay. She was a house of cards built on a foundation of sand, and she had no idea that the slightest wind would bring everything crashing down. The family's financial situation reached critical mass in the months before they contacted me. They owed more than $200,000 across various debts, and creditors had begun threatening legal action. The house, mortgaged beyond its value, was on the verge of foreclosure. My father's health was declining, adding medical bills to their mounting obligations. Tracy's income, impressive on paper, but largely consumed by her own extravagant spending, was insufficient to stabilize the sinking ship. They needed a rescue, and they needed it quickly. The family gathered to discuss their options. A council of war convened in the living room where I had once stood invisible and unvalued. My father suggested bankruptcy, but the shame of public financial failure was more than his pride could bear. My mother proposed selling the house, but the proceeds would barely cover what they owed. Various schemes were considered and rejected, each one foundering on the rocks of their collective irresponsibility. It was Tracy who suggested reaching out to me. The proposal emerged from her lips with casual cruelty, as though contacting the sister they had abandoned was simply another transaction to be managed. She pointed out that I had always been soft, always desperate for approval, always willing to sacrifice for family acceptance that never came. Even if I was still waitressing somewhere, Tracy reasoned I might have saved enough money over the years to make a difference, and if I had somehow done better for myself, all the more reason to exploit whatever resources I had accumulated. Their plan was simple in its cynicism. They would pretend to seek reconciliation, crafting an invitation that appealed to the emotional vulnerability they assumed still defined me. They would play on my desire to be accepted, to finally belong to the family that had rejected me. They would extract whatever financial assistance they could manage using guilt and manipulation as their primary tools. Once they had what they needed, they could decide whether to maintain the charade or discard me again. Tracy took charge of the outreach, composing the invitation with what she considered sophisticated manipulation. She chose the venue, deliberately selecting the Masterson Grand because it was the most impressive hotel she knew and because she wanted to showcase her own success in the hospitality industry. The irony that she was selecting a property owned by the sister she intended to deceive was lost on her entirely. She researched my address through methods I never fully discovered, violating my privacy with the same casual disregard she showed for every boundary. As she sealed the envelope containing my invitation, Tracy checked her reflection in the hallway mirror and smiled at what she saw. She was confident in her beauty, her charm, her ability to manipulate anyone who stood in her way. She had been doing it her entire life, bending our parents to her will, escaping consequences that should have taught her responsibility. She saw no reason why this situation would be any different. She probably still wants our approval, Tracy told our parents as she prepared to mail the letter. She always did. This will be easy. While my family was scheming to exploit what they imagined was my continued vulnerability, they had no conception of the life I had actually built. Tracy's assumption that I was still desperate for approval, still soft and manipulable, was based on a version of me that had ceased to exist the moment I boarded that Greyhound bus 14 years earlier. The woman who received their invitation was unrecognizable from the girl who had left their house with $62 and a broken heart. 10 years with Walter Masterson had transformed me in ways my family could never have predicted. My ascent through Masterson hotels was neither accidental nor easy. Or I started as a management trainee, the lowest rung on the corporate ladder, assigned to tasks that more privileged colleagues considered beneath them. I cleaned rooms when housekeeping was short-staffed. I worked the front desk during overnight shifts. I shadowed maintenance workers and kitchen staff and security personnel, learning every aspect of hotel operations from the ground up. Walter insisted on this approach, believing that effective leaders needed to understand every role in the organization they would eventually command. I embraced the philosophy, completely recognizing that knowledge of the entire operation would give me credibility that no business degree could provide. Within 2 years, I had been promoted to assistant manager at one of our mid-tier properties. The promotion came after I identified and resolved a persistent problem with guest complaints that previous managers had dismissed as unavoidable. I discovered that the issue stemmed not from difficult customers, but from a breakdown in communication between the front desk and housekeeping, a systemic flaw that created cascading failures throughout the guest experience. My solution was simple, but required convincing staff to change ingrained habits. I succeeded by treating every employee as a partner rather than a subordinate, explaining the reasoning behind the changes, and soliciting their input on implementation. The approach worked better than anyone expected, and word of my success spread through the company. By my 5th year, I had become regional director overseeing 12 properties across 3 states. My management philosophy, which had developed organically from my experiences at Lucky's Diner and my early years as a trainee, became increasingly recognized as something revolutionary within the company. I believed fundamentally that employees who felt respected and empowered would create exceptional experiences for guests. This seems obvious in retrospect, but the hospitality industry at the time was dominated by top-down management styles that treated frontline workers as interchangeable components. I did things differently. I learned the names of housekeepers and maintenance staff. I solicited feedback from bellhops and valets. I created systems that rewarded initiative and punished only genuine misconduct rather than honest mistakes. The results spoke for themselves. Properties under my oversight experienced dramatic drops in employee turnover, saving hundreds of thousands of dollars in recruitment and training costs. Guest satisfaction scores rose consistently, translating into repeat bookings and positive reviews that drove new business. Revenue increased. Complaints decreased. The properties I touched became top performers within the chain, and industry publications began taking notice. Articles appeared about the young executive who was reshaping Masterson's corporate culture, bringing human-centered management to an industry that had long treated workers as expendable. Walter watched my progress with satisfaction that I only later understood reflected his long-term planning. His health had begun declining during my 7th year with the company, a gradual deterioration that he initially hid from everyone, including me. When the diagnosis finally came, it was serious enough to force him to confront questions about succession that he had been contemplating quietly for years. Masterson Hotels was his life's work, the legacy of everything he had built since purchasing that first roadside motel. He had no children to inherit it, no family members he trusted with something so precious. He had only me. The decision he made shocked the small board of directors who advised on major company matters. Walter announced that he would begin transferring majority ownership to me through a carefully structured succession plan designed to minimize tax implications and ensure continuity of operations. The board members, most of whom had known Walter for decades, expressed concerns about my relative youth and limited public profile. Walter overruled them with the authority of someone who had built an empire and answered to no one. He had chosen his successor, and the matter was not open for debate. By the time I was 31 years old, I held controlling interest in Masterson Hotels, a private empire valued at more than $800 million. I became chairwoman, the youngest person to ever hold that title in our industry, responsible for 83 properties and thousands of employees across North America. The weight of that responsibility settled onto my shoulders like a familiar burden, heavy but manageable. I had been preparing for this moment without fully realizing it, accumulating skills and knowledge and relationships that now coalesced into genuine power. but I made a deliberate choice that distinguished me from most executives in my position. I avoided public appearances with near-obsessive dedication. I gave no interviews to business magazines or news outlets. I declined every invitation to industry conferences where I might be photographed or quoted. I maintained no social media presence and ensured that my image appeared nowhere online. The press, frustrated by their inability to profile the new leader of a major hospitality company, eventually dubbed me the Phantom Chairwoman, a mysterious figure known only through exceptional results rather than personal celebrity. My anonymity was not accidental. I had seen how wealth attracted opportunists, how success drew people who wanted to exploit connections for their own benefit. I had watched other executives become targets for manipulation by distant relatives, old acquaintances, and complete strangers who believed proximity to money entitled them to a share. I wanted none of that. More specifically, I wanted to protect myself from my past. I knew that my family existed somewhere, presumably still believing I was a failure, and I had no desire to give them any opportunity to re-enter my life. Invisibility was my shield against the people who had hurt me. I lived well but modestly by the standards of someone in my position. I owned a comfortable townhouse rather than a mansion. I drove a reliable sedan rather than a luxury vehicle. I wore quality clothing, but nothing that screamed wealth to casual observers. Most of my income went back into the company through reinvestment and into charitable causes through a foundation I established anonymously. I had learned that peace was worth more than fame, that contentment came from purpose rather than possessions. I had everything I needed and wanted, nothing that money alone could provide. For years, this arrangement worked perfectly. I ran my company from the shadows, known to my employees but invisible to the outside world. I found fulfillment in the work itself, rather than the recognition it might have brought. I built something meaningful while protecting myself from those who might try to take advantage of what I had built. But my carefully constructed anonymity was about to be shattered by the last people I ever expected to threaten it. The threat to my anonymity did not come from investigative journalists or curious competitors. It came from my own sister, and the chain of events that led to her discovery was something I only pieced together much later after the Christmas dinner had exposed everything. What I learned about Tracy's scheming in the months before our reunion explained the calculated cruelty I experienced that night and revealed depths of jealousy I had never fully appreciated. 6 months before the invitation arrived at my townhouse, Tracy was scrolling through industry publications during a slow afternoon at the hotel she managed. She had developed a habit of reading hospitality news, partly to appear informed during regional meetings and partly to feed her fantasy that she was a rising star in the business. On that particular day, she stumbled upon an article that would consume her thoughts for weeks to come. The headline referenced the Phantom Chairwoman of Masterson Hotels, the mysterious executive who had transformed the company while avoiding public attention. Tracy clicked on the article expecting to learn something useful for her own career advancement. Instead, she encountered a ghost from her past. The article included a grainy photograph taken at a company event, one of the rare images that had escaped my careful management of public exposure. The photo showed me from the side, partially obscured by other attendees, my face not fully visible, but my profile and posture unmistakable to anyone who had grown up with me. Tracy told me later during her breakdown at the Christmas dinner that she stared at that photograph for nearly an hour. She zoomed in until the pixels blurred. She compared it to old family photos she had buried in storage boxes. She refused to believe what her eyes were telling her, because believing it meant accepting something her entire identity had been built to deny. Her worthless sister, the forgotten daughter, the waitress who had slunk away with $62 and no future owned the company Tracy worked for. The weeks that followed were consumed by obsessive research. Tracy dug through every available source searching for confirmation of what she desperately hoped was a mistake. She found scattered references to D. Webb in corporate filings, mentions of a female executive who had risen through the ranks with unprecedented speed hints about a succession plan that had transferred controlling interest from Walter Masterson to his chosen protege. None of the sources included my full name or a clear photograph, but the cumulative evidence became impossible to dismiss. Tracy eventually accessed internal company records through her management credentials, violating multiple policies in the process, and found documentation that removed all doubt. Danielle Webb, her sister, was the chairwoman of Masterson Hotels. I can only imagine the psychological impact of that discovery. Tracy had built her entire self-concept around being the successful sister, the one with a future, the golden child, whose achievements justified the favoritism she had received throughout our childhood. Learning that I had surpassed her so completely, so invisibly, must have shattered something fundamental in her understanding of the world. She described the feeling to me later as physical pain, a jealousy so intense it made her nauseous and kept her awake at night. What Tracy did with that discovery revealed everything about her character. A different person might have reached out genuinely, acknowledging past wrongs and seeking authentic reconciliation. A different person might have felt shame about how she had treated me and wanted to make amends. Tracy felt only rage and resentment, and she channeled those emotions into a plan designed to hurt me in the deepest way possible. She kept her discovery secret from our parents. This decision was purely strategic. Tracy understood that if our mother and father learned about my wealth, their attention would immediately shift toward me. They would abandon Tracy to pursue the greater prize, leaving her with nothing but the debts she had helped create. Tracy could not allow that. She needed to maintain her position as the favored child, which meant controlling the flow of information and managing the family's perception of both sisters. Her plan emerged from weeks of bitter contemplation. She would organize a Christmas dinner at a Masterson property, bringing the family together under the pretense of celebration and reconciliation. She would orchestrate an evening of humiliation designed to prove that my money could not buy what she believed I truly wanted: family acceptance and love. In Tracy's twisted reasoning, publicly mocking me in front of our parents would demonstrate that I was still the rejected daughter, still unworthy of belonging, still beneath her despite any material success. She wanted to wound me emotionally in a way that no amount of wealth could heal. The venue selection was deliberate. Tracy chose the Masterson Grand, the flagship property of the chain, because it represented the pinnacle of the empire she now knew I controlled. She believed she had contacts there through her position as a manager in the same company relationships she could leverage to ensure the evening proceeded according to her design. She imagined the delicious irony of humiliating me in my own hotel surrounded by staff who would witness my family's rejection and perhaps whisper about it afterward. Tracy rehearsed the evening obsessively in her mind. She planned the subtle jabs she would deliver, the condescending expressions of pity for my imagined poverty, the pointed comparisons between her legitimate management career and the waitressing she assumed I was still doing. She prepared our parents with stories about Tracy's upcoming promotion, establishing a narrative of success that would contrast sharply with whatever humble circumstances I would present. She anticipated my discomfort, my desperate attempts to fit in my pathetic gratitude at being included after so many years of exclusion. What Tracy failed to understand, what her arrogance made impossible for her to see, was that she was building a trap for herself rather than for me. She was organizing an ambush in enemy territory, planning a battle on ground I controlled completely. Every employee at the Masterson Grand knew my face and reported ultimately to me. The general manager was someone I had personally mentored and trusted implicitly. The security systems, the staff communications, the very walls of that hotel were extensions of my authority. Tracy saw none of this because she could not imagine a world in which I held power. Her entire life had been built on the assumption that I was inferior, and that assumption had become so fundamental to her identity that contradictory evidence simply failed to register. She looked at the facts and saw only what she wanted to see, an opportunity to reassert her dominance over the sister who had always been beneath her. As she finalized her plans and mailed the invitation to my townhouse, Tracy smiled at her own reflection with satisfaction. She believed she was about to win a victory that would restore the natural order of things, putting the forgotten daughter back in her proper place. She had no idea that she was walking into a battlefield designed and controlled by the very person she intended to destroy. The evening of the Christmas dinner arrived with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial. I spent the afternoon in quiet preparation, not rehearsing what I would say, but centering myself for what I knew would be an emotional confrontation, regardless of how it unfolded. I had faced hostile boardrooms and crisis situations that threatened to destroy properties worth millions, but none of that compared to the weight of returning to the family that had broken me. This was personal in a way business never could be. I chose my outfit with deliberate care, a simple black dress, elegant in its cut, but devoid of obvious designer labels or ostentatious details. No jewelry except for a modest watch, no accessories that screamed wealth or demanded attention. I wanted to arrive looking exactly as my family expected me to look, presentable but unremarkable, someone who had managed to survive but certainly not thrive. Their assumptions about my circumstances would be part of the evening's revelation, and I saw no reason to spoil the surprise prematurely. My security team received instructions to remain invisible throughout the evening. I employed several professionals who typically accompanied me to company events, but their presence tonight would have raised questions I was not ready to answer. Instead, they positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the hotel, close enough to respond if needed, but invisible to anyone not specifically looking for them. My personal assistant, Sarah, would monitor the situation from the hotel's security office, watching through cameras, and ready to intervene if the evening took an unexpected turn. I did not anticipate needing such precautions, but I had learned long ago that preparation was never wasted. The drive to the Masterson Grand took 20 minutes through light evening traffic. I spent the time watching the city lights pass by my window, thinking about the girl who had once fled this same region with nothing but a bag of clothes and a handful of dollars. That girl had been terrified and alone, convinced that the family who abandoned her was right about her worthlessness. The woman in the car now controlled an empire and answered to no one. The contrast between those two versions of myself felt almost impossible to reconcile, yet both were equally real. I arrived at the hotel precisely on time, neither early nor late. The valet recognized me immediately, his eyes widening slightly before professionalism reasserted itself. I gave him a small nod that communicated everything I was here on personal business and discretion was expected. He returned the nod and said nothing beyond the standard greeting as he took my keys. Walking through the lobby of the Masterson Grand always filled me with quiet pride. This was our flagship property, the crown jewel of the chain, and every detail reflected the standards I had helped establish. The marble floors gleamed under warm lighting. The staff moved with practiced efficiency, greeting guests with genuine warmth rather than scripted politeness. Fresh flowers adorned strategic points throughout the space, their subtle fragrance contributing to an atmosphere of refined welcome. I had spent years shaping this culture, and seeing it function so smoothly never failed to satisfy. The restaurant occupied the hotel's ground floor, an acclaimed establishment that regularly appeared on lists of the city's finest dining experiences. I paused at the entrance, scanning the room, until I spotted my family at a corner table. They had not yet noticed my arrival, and I took a moment to observe them before approaching. They looked older than I remembered, though that should not have surprised me after 14 years. My father's hair had gone completely gray, and he seemed smaller, somehow diminished in a way that extended beyond physical stature. My mother's face bore lines that suggested worry more than laughter, and her posture carried a tension I did not recall from my childhood. Tracy sat between them, visibly younger and more polished, but there was something brittle in her composure that I recognized from my years of reading people. They were performing confidence they did not feel. I took a deep breath and walked toward them. The greeting that followed was ice-cold, disguised as warmth. My mother rose first, offering an awkward hug that felt more like an obligation than an expression of affection. Her arms barely touched my back before releasing, as though prolonged contact might communicate something she did not actually feel. My father extended his hand for a stiff handshake, the gesture formal and distant, his eyes assessing me with an expression I could not quite read. Tracy delivered a performative kiss on the cheek, her lips barely grazing my skin, her smile wide, but her eyes calculating. My mother stepped back and looked me over with poorly concealed surprise. "You look well," she said, the words carrying an undertone of disbelief. She had expected me to appear defeated, worn down by years of struggle, perhaps visibly poor in a way that would confirm everything they had always believed about my prospects. Finding me healthy and composed clearly unsettled her. I offered nothing but polite gratitude for the compliment, revealing nothing about my actual circumstances. Tracy filled the silence, immediately steering the conversation toward herself with practiced ease. She began describing the hotel she managed, emphasizing her important responsibilities and her trajectory toward becoming a regional director. She spoke about occupancy rates and guest satisfaction scores and staff management challenges, peppering her monologue with industry terminology designed to impress. I listened quietly, nodding at appropriate intervals, asking occasional questions that encouraged her to continue talking. The more she revealed about her professional life, the more I understood how completely she had deceived herself about her own competence. Before sitting down to order, I excused myself to visit the restroom. My family barely acknowledged my departure, too absorbed in their own conversation to notice my brief absence. I walked through the restaurant with measured steps, aware that several staff members had recognized me and were carefully avoiding any acknowledgement that might reveal my identity. In the privacy of the restroom, I pulled out my phone and composed a brief message to Marcus Chen, the general manager of the Masterson Grand. Marcus was someone I had personally mentored years earlier, promoting him to his current position based on his exceptional judgment and unwavering discretion. He knew I was dining with family tonight. I had briefed him earlier in the week without explaining the complicated history involved. "I'm at table 12 with family," I typed. "Please come to greet me in exactly 45 minutes. Standard protocol." Standard protocol meant approaching with the formal respect due to the chairwoman acknowledging my position in a way that would be unmistakable to anyone present. Marcus would understand immediately what I was requesting and would execute it flawlessly. I looked at myself in the mirror above the sink. The woman staring back at me appeared calm, steady, in complete control of her emotions. I had waited 14 years for this moment. 14 years of building a life that proved everything my family believed about me was wrong. 45 more minutes of performance remained. 45 minutes of enduring whatever cruelty they had planned, and then the truth would be revealed. On my terms, on my timing, on my stage. I returned to the table wearing a serene smile, settling into my chair as the first course was being served. My family continued their performance of celebration, Tracy monopolizing the conversation, while my parents occasionally interjected with supportive comments about her achievements. They had no idea what was coming. I began counting down the minutes. The countdown began the moment I settled back into my chair. 45 minutes stretched before me like a test of endurance, and I understood that my family would use every second to inflict whatever damage they could. What I had not anticipated was how quickly they would abandon any pretense of reconciliation and reveal the true purpose of this gathering. The cruelty began before the first course had even been fully served. My father initiated the assault with the casual confidence of someone who had spent decades diminishing others without consequence. He waited until the server had placed appetizers before us, ensuring we would not be interrupted, then turned to me with a smirk that transported me instantly back to childhood. "So, Danielle," he said, his voice carrying the condescension I remembered so well, still waitressing, "or did you finally find a real job?" The question was designed to humiliate, to establish immediately that he viewed me as a failure whose circumstances were worthy of mockery rather than genuine inquiry. Before I could formulate a response, Tracy interjected with perfectly rehearsed cruelty. "Daddy, don't be cruel," she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "I'm sure she's doing fine." She paused, letting the words hang in the air before delivering the blow she had clearly prepared. For someone without ambition, I mean. The table erupted in laughter, my parents joining Tracy in amusement at my expense. The sound of their shared mockery echoed through the restaurant, drawing glances from nearby diners who could not help but notice the commotion. I simply smiled and said that I was doing well. "Thank you." My voice remained steady, my expression pleasant, my body language relaxed. I offered no defense, no explanation, no indication that their words had affected me in any way. This response clearly frustrated Tracy, who had expected tears or defensive anger, some emotional reaction she could exploit to demonstrate my continued weakness. Instead, she found herself facing a composure that her attacks could not penetrate. The mockery escalated as the main course arrived. Tracy dominated the conversation, transforming every topic into an opportunity to showcase her own supposed achievements while highlighting my presumed failures. She described her salary in terms designed to sound impressive, though I knew from company records that her compensation was modest by industry standards and would soon be terminated entirely given the misconduct documented in her file. She spoke of executive decisions she made daily, unaware that most of her decisions had created problems that subordinates quietly corrected behind her back. She referenced her connections with upper management, oblivious to the fact that those connections found her difficult and were counting the days until human resources finalized her termination paperwork. At one point, Tracy gestured expansively at the elegant restaurant surrounding us, sweeping her arm to encompass the crystal chandeliers, the impeccable table settings, the attentive staff moving gracefully between tables. One day she said with exaggerated pity, "Maybe you'll be able to afford a place like this, Danielle." Maybe. The word hung in the air, suggesting that even this modest aspiration was likely beyond my reach. My mother added her own contribution to the assault, her soft voice somehow more cutting than my father's bluster. "We always knew Tracy was the successful one," she observed, nodding with satisfaction at her younger daughter. "Some people are just born for more." The implication was clear. I had been born for less, my limited potential evident from childhood, my departure from the family merely confirming what they had always suspected about my inadequacy. I ate quietly through these attacks, savoring the excellent food, while offering minimal responses that neither encouraged nor discouraged their behavior. I checked my watch, discreetly tracking the minutes as they accumulated. Other diners had begun noticing our table, drawn by the volume of my family's conversation and the obvious cruelty of their remarks. I saw expressions of discomfort on nearby faces, strangers who recognized bullying when they witnessed it, and felt secondhand embarrassment on my behalf. A server approached twice to check on our table, his professional smile, unable to hide his concern about the situation unfolding in his section. The cruelest blow came from Tracy, directly delivered with the theatrical timing of someone who had rehearsed this moment extensively. She set down her wine glass and leaned forward, fixing me with a stare that combined triumph and contempt in equal measure. "You know what's funny?" she asked, not waiting for a response. "I manage a hotel in the Masterson chain." She paused to let this information sink in, clearly expecting me to be impressed. "The biggest hospitality company in the region, world-class properties, thousands of employees, hundreds of millions in revenue. That's my world now, Danielle. That's the level I operate at." She leaned back in her chair, satisfaction radiating from every pore. Meanwhile, she continued, "You probably don't even know what Masterson is. You're probably still serving coffee to truck drivers at some roadside diner, completely oblivious to how the real world works." The words were designed to wound, to emphasize the vast gulf she imagined existed between her prestigious career and my humble existence. Tracy's expression hardened as she delivered her final verdict. "Face it, Danielle. You walked out on this family thinking you were better than us. You thought you could make it on your own without our support, without our guidance." She shook her head slowly, performing disappointment. "And look at you now. Nothing. You're nothing. You've always been nothing, and you'll always be nothing. The only difference is that now everyone can see it." The words hung in the air like poison, spreading through the space between us. My parents nodded in agreement, their expression suggesting that Tracy had merely articulated what they had always believed. They looked at me expectantly, waiting for the emotional collapse they felt certain would follow such a devastating assessment. They wanted tears. They wanted desperate denials. They wanted me to finally confirm their lifelong conviction that I was worthless. I glanced at my watch. 44 minutes had passed since I sent my message to Marcus. Almost time. I looked up from my watch and across the restaurant, and my heart rate elevated slightly as I spotted a familiar figure approaching through the elegant crowd of diners. Marcus Chen moved with the confident grace of someone completely comfortable in his environment, his tailored suit impeccable, his posture radiating the authority that came with managing one of the finest hotels in the country. Behind him walked two assistant managers, their presence adding weight to whatever was about to unfold. My family had not yet noticed the approaching delegation. They were too absorbed in their own satisfaction, too busy congratulating themselves on successfully putting me in my place. Tracy was already reaching for her wine glass, ready to toast her own cleverness in orchestrating this evening of humiliation. The moment I had waited 14 years for had finally arrived. Marcus Chen moved through the restaurant with the unhurried confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was. I watched him approach, tracking his progress through the elegant space, while my family remained oblivious to the significance of what was about to unfold. Other diners noticed the small procession, their conversations pausing momentarily as the general manager and his two assistant managers navigated between tables with obvious purpose. Staff members stepped aside respectfully, acknowledging the authority that Marcus carried as naturally as his impeccable tailored suit. My family finally registered the approaching delegation when Marcus was only a few steps away. Tracy noticed first, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized the formal bearing of hotel management. She straightened in her chair, adjusting her posture and smoothing her expression into what she probably considered professional composure. I could see her preparing to leverage this moment, ready to name-drop her position within the Masterson chain, eager to demonstrate her connections to upper management in front of the sister she had just finished declaring worthless. But Marcus did not even glance at Tracy. He walked past her without acknowledgement, his attention focused entirely on me. He stopped directly beside my chair, and I saw confusion flash across my family's faces as they tried to understand why this important-looking man was ignoring the successful daughter to address the failure. Then Marcus bowed. It was a slight, respectful inclination of his head, the kind of gesture reserved for someone of significant authority. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across our table and to the nearby diners who had turned to observe the interaction. "Madam Chairwoman," he said, his tone formal and deferential. "Welcome back to the Masterson Grand. The entire staff is honored by your presence this evening." The silence that followed was absolute. It descended over our table like a physical force, freezing everyone in place. Tracy's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips, suspended in air, as her brain struggled to process what she had just heard. My father's face drained of color so rapidly I thought for a moment he might faint. My mother's fork slipped from her fingers and clattered against her plate, the sharp sound cutting through the stillness like a gunshot. No one spoke. No one moved. The word chairwoman hung in the air between us, transforming everything they thought they knew about this evening, and about me. My father was the first to attempt speech, though what emerged was barely coherent. "Chair... woman..." He stammered the word, fragmenting as his voice failed him. His eyes darted between me and Marcus, searching for some indication that this was a joke or a misunderstanding. He found nothing but professional sincerity in Marcus's expression and calm composure in mine. Marcus continued as though my father had not spoken, maintaining the formal protocol appropriate for addressing the owner of the company he served. "We have prepared the owner's suite for your inspection, Ms. Webb," he reported. "The department heads are assembled and ready to present whenever you are available. Additionally, Chef Morrison has prepared a special tasting menu in your honor, should you wish to experience it later this evening." Around us, the restaurant had grown noticeably quieter. Other diners had turned to observe the scene unfolding at table 12, their expressions reflecting varying degrees of surprise and fascination. I could see them connecting the pieces: the phantom chairwoman, the mysterious figure who had run Masterson Hotels from the shadows for years, had just been revealed to be the simply dressed woman who had been absorbing verbal abuse for the past hour, the woman her own family had called nothing, the woman they had mocked for her poverty and lack of ambition. That woman owned everything they could see. I rose from my chair with deliberate grace, taking a moment to adjust my napkin and place it beside my plate. The movement was unhurried, controlled the gesture of someone who had nothing to prove and no reason to rush. I had waited 14 years for this moment. I could afford to let it unfold at whatever pace I chose. I looked at my family, then truly looked at them, allowing myself to observe every detail of their reactions without the protective distance I had maintained throughout the evening. My father appeared to have aged a decade in the span of seconds, his earlier smugness replaced by something approaching terror. My mother's carefully constructed poise had collapsed entirely, leaving behind a woman confronting the magnitude of her misjudgment. And Tracy, the golden child, who had orchestrated this entire evening to humiliate me, sat frozen with her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, no words emerging because no words could possibly address what she had done. For a moment, I felt the familiar urge to comfort them. It rose from somewhere deep inside me, a conditioned response developed over 18 years of being the accommodating daughter, the peacekeeper, the one who absorbed pain rather than inflicting it. Part of me wanted to soften the blow to offer reassurance that everything would be fine, to ease the transition from their fantasy of my failure to the reality of my success. I let that urge pass through me without acting on it. I had spent too many years being what they needed me to be, diminishing myself to make them comfortable accepting their cruelty because resistance seemed futile. Those years were over. I was no longer the girl who stood in hallways waiting to be noticed. I was no longer the daughter who would sacrifice her own future to clean up Tracy's mistakes. I was no longer nothing. I straightened my spine and turned to Marcus with the small professional smile I used in boardrooms and executive meetings. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I will be ready to tour the property shortly. Please inform the department heads that I appreciate their patience and look forward to speaking with each of them." Then I turned back to my family, allowing my expression to soften just slightly without losing its composure. They stared at me with the desperate incomprehension of people whose entire understanding of the world had just been demolished. Everything they believed about me, every assumption that had justified their treatment of me for 3 decades, had been revealed as catastrophically wrong. Marcus spoke again, his voice cutting through the frozen tableau with professional precision. "Shall we take the private elevator, Madam Chairwoman? The presidential suite is prepared for your use throughout your stay, and your security team has completed their sweep of the executive floors." I watched my family process these additional details, each one adding another layer to their understanding of how completely they had misjudged me. Private elevators, presidential suites, security teams. This was not a woman who had merely done well for herself. This was a woman who commanded an empire, who moved through the world with resources and authority beyond anything they had ever possessed or imagined. Tracy finally managed to produce sound, though it emerged as little more than a strangled whisper. "Danielle," she said, her voice cracking on my name. When? I don't." I regarded my sister with an expression carefully balanced between compassion and resolve. "We have much to discuss," I said simply, "but perhaps not here." I glanced around at the other diners, who were still watching our table with undisguised interest. Perhaps somewhere more private would be appropriate for what needs to be said. The suggestion of privacy seemed to break something loose in my father. His hands trembled visibly as he gripped the edge of the table knuckles, whitening with the force of his hold, as though the polished wood was the only thing keeping him anchored to a reality that had suddenly become unrecognizable. He stared at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, a mixture of incomprehension and something that looked almost like fear. "Chairwoman of what exactly?" he demanded, his voice cracking on the final word. The question emerged louder than he probably intended, drawing additional attention from the diners around us, who were already watching our table with undisguised fascination. Marcus answered before I could respond, his tone maintaining the professional neutrality appropriate for delivering factual information. "Masterson Hotels, sir," he explained calmly. 83 properties across North America, including this flagship location. Ms. Webb has been the majority owner and chairwoman of the company for nearly 3 years. He paused, then added with subtle emphasis, "She is in fact my employer." I watched my father's face contort through a rapid sequence of emotions as he processed this information. Confusion came first, the genuine bewilderment of someone confronting facts that contradicted everything he believed to be true. Then disbelief, his mind rejecting what his ears had clearly heard, searching for some alternative explanation that would restore the natural order of things. Horror followed, as the implications began to sink in, as he understood that the daughter he had dismissed and degraded had achieved success beyond anything he had ever accomplished. But it was the final emotion that revealed the most about my father's character. After the confusion and disbelief and horror had cycled through, what settled on his face was something that looked almost like anger. I recognized it immediately because I had seen it so many times during my childhood, that particular expression of resentment he wore whenever reality failed to conform to his expectations. How dare I surpass him so completely? How dare I prove him wrong about my worthlessness? The audacity of my success seemed to offend him more than anything else about this revelation. My mother recovered faster than my father, her survival instincts engaging with the ruthless efficiency that had allowed her to navigate decades of marriage to a difficult man. I could almost see the calculations happening behind her eyes as she processed the new information and immediately began searching for ways to turn it to her advantage. If Danielle was wealthy, if Danielle controlled an empire, then perhaps this situation could still work in their favor. Perhaps the goal had simply changed from extracting money from a poor relation to extracting money from a rich one. She reached out toward me with hands that trembled despite her attempt at composure. "Danielle, sweetheart," she said, her voice wavering between genuine shock and calculated warmth. "We had no idea. We never could have imagined." She paused, struggling to find words that would bridge the enormous gap between how she had treated me and how she now needed to treat me. "We are so proud of you. So incredibly proud." The words rang hollow in the air between us. Proud. They were proud of me now when my success had been revealed in a way they could not ignore or dismiss. They had not been proud during the 18 years I lived under their roof, earning good grades and working hard and asking for nothing. They had not been proud during the 14 years I had been building this empire, years during which they never once attempted to learn what had become of me. Their pride had materialized only in this moment when they understood that I possessed something they wanted. My mother's eyes kept darting to the other diners who were watching our table with varying degrees of interest. I understood what she was seeing: witnesses. The public humiliation they had planned for me had reversed entirely and completely. They had come to this dinner intending to demonstrate my failure, to mock my poverty, to prove that the forgotten daughter had indeed turned out to be nothing. Instead, every person in this restaurant had now witnessed their shame. They had seen a family belittle and demean a woman who turned out to be one of the most successful executives in the hospitality industry. The story would spread. People would talk. The humiliation they had designed for me had become their own. Tracy remained frozen in her seat, her carefully constructed reality crumbling around her like a building collapsing in slow motion. I could see her mind working frantically, replaying every word she had spoken throughout the evening, every insult and condescension and cruel comparison. She had boasted about managing a hotel in the Masterson chain. Danielle owned the entire company. She had mocked me for not knowing what Masterson was. Danielle was the phantom chairwoman the industry whispered about. She had called me nothing, declared me worthless, announced to everyone at this table, and many of the diners around us, that I had no ambition and no future. Danielle controlled whether Tracy had a job tomorrow. The realization seemed to hit Tracy in waves, each one more devastating than the last. I watched the blood drain from her face as she understood the full scope of what she had done. She had not merely insulted her sister at a family dinner. She had insulted her employer, the person who held absolute authority over her career, in the middle of a flagship property where staff members were surely already sharing what they had witnessed. She had spent 6 months planning this evening, carefully orchestrating every detail of what was supposed to be my humiliation, and she had delivered herself directly into my hands. "I didn't," Tracy whispered, her voice barely audible. She seemed unable to complete the sentence, unable to articulate what she hadn't done, or hadn't meant, or hadn't understood. The words died in her throat, replaced by a silence that spoke more eloquently than any explanation she might have offered. I looked at each member of my family in turn, allowing myself to observe them fully without the protective detachment I had maintained throughout the evening. My father gripping the table with trembling hands, his pride shattered by the daughter he had declared worthless. My mother calculating how to salvage advantage from catastrophe, her expressions of pride transparently motivated by self-interest. My sister frozen in the wreckage of her own scheming, confronting the reality that her cruelty had consequences she had never anticipated. These were the people who had raised me. These were the people who had taught me that I was not enough, that I did not deserve love or attention or investment in my future. These were the people who had cut me out of their lives because I refused to sacrifice myself for their convenience, then reached out only when they needed something from me. Looking at them now in the aftermath of their attempted humiliation, I felt something I had not expected. I felt tired. Not triumphant, not vindicated, not filled with the satisfaction of revenge finally achieved. Just tired. Tired of the dysfunction, tired of the manipulation, tired of the endless cycle of cruelty that seemed to define how this family operated. "Shall we continue this conversation somewhere more private?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. "I believe there is much we need to discuss, and I would prefer not to have that discussion in front of an audience." Marcus led us through the restaurant toward a discreet corridor that most guests would never notice. My family followed in stunned silence, their earlier confidence entirely evaporated. I walked ahead with Marcus, maintaining the composed bearing that had become second nature over years of navigating high-stakes situations, while my parents and Tracy trailed behind like children being escorted to face consequences they could not escape. The private elevator was tucked away from public view, accessible only to those who knew it existed and had authorization to use it. Marcus pressed the button, and the doors opened immediately, revealing an interior of polished brass and mirrors that reflected our small group from multiple angles. I stepped in first, followed by my family, who huddled together as though proximity might offer protection from whatever was coming. Marcus remained outside, giving me a small nod of acknowledgement before the doors closed. The elevator rose silently toward the penthouse level. No one spoke during the ascent. My parents stared at the floor or the walls or anywhere except at me, unable to meet my eyes, now that the power dynamic had shifted so completely. Tracy seemed to have shrunk into herself. Her earlier bravado entirely collapsed her expression, that of someone awaiting a verdict they already knew would be devastating. When the doors opened, we emerged into a private foyer where two staff members waited to greet us. They bowed slightly as I passed, addressing me with the genuine respect that came from years of positive working relationships rather than mere protocol. "Welcome back, Ms. Webb," one of them said warmly. "Please let us know if you need anything at all." The other added, "It's wonderful to see you, Madam Chairwoman. The kitchen has prepared refreshments whenever you're ready." I thanked them both by name, asking briefly about one's daughter, who had recently started college, and the other's recovery from a minor surgery. Their faces brightened at the personal attention, and I saw Tracy watching these exchanges with an expression I could not quite interpret. Perhaps she was noticing what I already knew, that these employees actually liked me. Their smiles were genuine, their warmth unforced, their respect earned through years of fair treatment and authentic connection. I had built a culture where staff members felt valued, and that culture was visible in every interaction. Tracy managed hotels too, but no one at her properties smiled like that. Her employees feared her, or tolerated her, or simply endured her until they could find employment elsewhere. The contrast between her leadership and mine was written on the faces of every person we passed. The owner's suite occupied the entire top floor of the Masterson Grand, 3,000 square feet of luxury, designed to impress even the most discerning guests. I had stayed here many times during visits to the flagship property, using the space for meetings and retreats, and occasional moments of solitude when the pressures of leadership required distance from the everyday operations. The suite felt like an extension of myself, furnished according to my preferences, and decorated with items that held personal significance. My family entered behind me, their eyes widening as they took in the magnificent space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city skyline, the lights glittering against the darkness like scattered jewels. A private terrace extended beyond the glass, furnished with comfortable seating and heated for year-round use. The interior featured elegant furnishings in warm neutrals, original artwork on the walls, and fresh flowers that perfumed the air with subtle fragrance. But it was the awards and photographs that captured Tracy's attention. One wall displayed the recognition I had received throughout my career, crystal trophies and framed certificates and professional accolades that documented my rise through the industry. A prominent frame showcased the night I received Hospitality Executive of the Year from the Industry Association, the most prestigious individual honor in our field. I was photographed accepting the award with a genuine smile, surrounded by peers who had voted to recognize my contributions. Another photograph showed me standing beside Walter Masterson at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, both of us beaming as we inaugurated a newly renovated property. The image captured a moment of shared pride between mentor and protege, between the man who had built an empire and the woman who would inherit it. Tracy stared at this photograph for a long moment, and I could see her mentally constructing the timeline of a career she had known nothing about, achievements that had accumulated, while she assumed I was struggling somewhere in poverty and failure. She was also recognizing something else. This was a career she had tried to destroy before it even began. The scholarship letter she had burned when we were teenagers would have sent me to Cornell's hotel management program. If that letter had reached me, my path into this industry might have begun differently. But Tracy's sabotage had forced me onto a harder road, one that led through diners and overnight shifts and chance encounters that ultimately delivered greater success than any Ivy League program could have guaranteed. I waited until the suite door closed behind us, sealing us into privacy, before allowing my composure to shift. The pleasant neutrality I had maintained throughout the evening gave way to something more direct, more honest about the gravity of what we needed to discuss. "Tracy," I said, my voice calm but carrying an edge that had not been present before, "did you think I would not find out?" Tracy blanched, what little color remained in her face draining away entirely. "Find out?" What she asked, but the question was weak transparently, an attempt to delay rather than a genuine inquiry. I produced my phone from the small clutch I had carried throughout the evening. On the screen was an internal report from our corporate security team, a summary of irregular access patterns to company databases that had been flagged 6 months earlier. I turned the screen toward Tracy so she could see the documentation of her own investigation into my identity. 6 months ago, I said you discovered that I was the chairwoman of Masterson Hotels. You accessed internal records using your management credentials records you had no legitimate reason to view. You confirmed that your sister, the one you had always dismissed as worthless, owned the company that employed you. Tracy's expression confirmed everything I was saying, her face a canvas of guilt and fear that no denial could contradict. You chose this hotel deliberately, I continued. You organized tonight's dinner at the flagship property of my own company, the crown jewel of the empire I built. You planned every detail of this evening to humiliate me in front of our parents, believing that I would crumble emotionally under their cruelty. You thought my desire for family acceptance would be my weakness, that mocking me in front of the people whose approval I once craved would prove that money and success could not buy what I truly wanted. How did you— Tracy started, then stopped, unable to complete the question. I run this company, I said quietly, the words carrying more weight than any shouted accusation could have managed. I know everything that happens within it. I know about the marketing funds you embezzled. I know about the employees you bullied into quitting. I know about the falsified reports you submitted to hide your property's declining performance. And I know that you spent 6 months planning tonight, crafting what you imagined would be my ultimate humiliation, while remaining completely oblivious to the fact that you were building a trap for yourself. Tracy's voice shook when she finally managed to speak. I did not mean— The words tumbled out, incomplete fragments of excuses that could not possibly address the magnitude of what she had done. I looked at my sister with an expression that communicated clearly what I did not need to say aloud. Explanations were far too late. The silence that followed my confrontation of Tracy stretched into uncomfortable seconds that felt like hours. My family stood scattered around the magnificent suite, surrounded by evidence of my success, confronting the reality that their carefully planned evening had collapsed into catastrophe. I watched them recalibrate, watched the gears turning behind their eyes as they searched for new approaches to a situation that had spiraled entirely beyond their control. My father recovered first, his survival instincts apparently sharper than I had given him credit for. He stepped forward, his trembling hands now clasped in front of him in a gesture that was probably meant to convey humility, but looked more like a man preparing to negotiate. His expression shifted from the horror and anger I had observed in the restaurant to something resembling contrition, though I recognized immediately that this was performance rather than genuine remorse. "Danielle, honey," he began, his voice softening into a tone I had rarely heard him use. "We may have made some mistakes in the past. I acknowledge that. We were not perfect parents, and perhaps we did not always treat you fairly." He paused, allowing the admission to settle clearly, expecting me to respond with gratitude for this unprecedented moment of accountability. When I said nothing, he continued, warming to his argument. "But we are family. That has to mean something, does it not? Blood is blood. Whatever happened before, we are still connected. We are still your parents, and Tracy is still your sister. Family is supposed to support each other through difficult times." He glanced around the suite, taking in the luxury that surrounded us, the evidence of wealth that exceeded anything he had ever possessed. "The truth is," he said, his voice dropping into a confidential register, "we have fallen on hard times. The economy has been brutal. Bad investments, unexpected expenses. You know how these things go. Life has not been kind to us these past few years." I remained silent, watching him build toward whatever request he was constructing. "If you could find it in your heart to help us," he said, the words emerging with carefully calibrated hesitance. "Just a loan, really. Nothing permanent. We could finally be a real family again. We could put the past behind us and start over. All of us together, the way family is supposed to be." The manipulation was so transparent, it almost impressed me. He had compressed years of estrangement and cruelty into mistakes, reframed their calculated exclusion of me as imperfect parenting, and now dangled the promise of family acceptance as a reward for financial assistance. The message was clear: give us money and we will finally treat you like you belong. My mother stepped in before I could respond, apparently deciding that my father's approach required reinforcement. She moved toward me with arms slightly extended, her expression shifting into something meant to convey maternal warmth. "We always loved you, Danielle," she said, her voice thick with emotion that might have been genuine or might have been manufactured for effect. "Maybe we did not show it well. Maybe we made mistakes in how we expressed our feelings. But you were always in our hearts. Always." I listened to her words without interrupting, allowing her to complete the performance she had prepared. When she finished, I asked a simple question. What was my favorite book as a child? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She blinked, her expression flickering with confusion, before settling into something like discomfort. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The silence stretched between us. "What did I want to be when I grew up?" I continued, my voice soft but steady. "When did I graduate high school? What was the name of my best friend in elementary school? What subject did I struggle with most? What made me laugh?" Each question landed like a small stone dropped into still water, ripples of silence spreading outward. My mother's face reddened progressively as the seconds passed without answers. She knew none of these things. She had lived in the same house with me for 18 years, had been present for every stage of my childhood and adolescence, and she could not answer a single basic question about who I was as a person. "Those things do not matter," she finally said, her voice defensive. "What matters is that we are family, that we love each other, that we want to move forward together." "They mattered to me," I interrupted softly. My voice carried no anger, only a weariness that surprised even me. "And you did not know any of the answers because you never asked, not once in 18 years. You never wondered what I was thinking or feeling or hoping for. You never cared enough to learn who I actually was. I was just the other daughter, the one who was not Tracy, the one who could be ignored because Tracy required all of your attention. My mother's mouth opened and closed, but no response emerged. The truth of my words was undeniable, and even her considerable skill at deflection could not manufacture a rebuttal. Tracy, who had been standing apart from our parents during their attempts at reconciliation, now stepped forward with a new approach. Tears had begun streaming down her face, whether genuine or summoned for effect I could not determine. Her shoulders shook with what appeared to be suppressed sobs, and her voice emerged small and broken. "You do not understand what my life has been like," she said, the words tumbling out between shaky breaths. "You think everything has been easy for me, but it has not. I have struggled too. Bad relationships that left me devastated. Workplace stress that keeps me up at night. The constant pressure of trying to meet everyone's expectations while feeling like I am drowning." She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, a gesture calculated to emphasize her vulnerability. "You do not understand the pressure I have been under," she continued. "Everyone always expected so much from me. Mom and Dad, the company, everyone. I have had to fight for everything I have, and it has been exhausting." Her voice rose with what sounded like righteous indignation. "Everything came easy for you, Danielle. You walked away from the family and just happened to meet the right person at the right time. You got lucky. Some rich old man decided to hand you a company, and suddenly you are successful. But I have had to earn everything through my own hard work, with no one helping me, no one giving me anything." I watched this performance without expression, recognizing every element of the manipulation she was attempting. The tears designed to evoke sympathy. The reversal of victim and perpetrator, casting herself as the one who had struggled while I had merely been fortunate. The erasure of her own cruelty and sabotage, replaced by a narrative where she was the hard-working sister and I was the lucky one. These were not apologies. None of what my family had offered since we entered this suite constituted genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing or authentic remorse for the pain they had caused. These were manipulation tactics, strategies designed to extract what they wanted from me while conceding as little as possible. My father offered conditional family acceptance in exchange for money. My mother offered claims of love without any evidence of actually knowing or caring about me. Tracy offered victimhood, attempting to make me feel guilty for success she believed I had not earned. They still saw me as a tool to be used, not a person to be valued. Tracy's tears continued flowing as she stepped closer, reaching out to take my hand in both of hers. Her grip was desperate, her eyes searching my face for signs of the softening she expected to find there. "We knew you would help us," she sniffled, her voice quavering with manufactured vulnerability. "You always do. That is who you are, Danielle. You have always been the one who takes care of everyone else. You have always been there when we needed you." She squeezed my hand, her expression shifting into something approaching hope. "You will help us now too, right?" I withdrew my hand from Tracy's grasp, slowly, deliberately, allowing the gesture to communicate what words had not yet conveyed. I did not answer her question. Instead, I turned away from my family and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that dominated one wall of the suite. The city spread out before me, millions of lights glittering against the darkness. A landscape I had quietly conquered over 14 years of relentless work. I had stood at windows like this many times, contemplating decisions that affected thousands of employees and hundreds of millions of dollars. But I had never stood at a window, preparing to say what I was about to say. When I began to speak, my voice carried no anger. Anger would have been easier, would have provided a kind of armor against the vulnerability of what I needed to express. Instead, I spoke with the quiet devastation of accumulated pain wounds that had never fully healed because no one had ever acknowledged they existed. "Do you remember my 12th birthday?" I asked, not turning from the window. The question hung in the air behind me. I remember it perfectly. I woke up excited because 12 felt important, felt like I was becoming a real person. I waited all day for someone to say something. Breakfast passed, then lunch, then dinner. No one mentioned it. Not once. I finally said something that evening, and Mom looked surprised and apologized. She'd been busy planning Tracy's dance recital, and it slipped her mind. Tracy was 10. Her recital was 3 weeks away. but that mattered more than her older daughter turning 12. I heard movement behind me, perhaps someone shifting uncomfortably, but no one spoke. "Do you remember Christmas when I was 14?" I continued. I came downstairs and Tracy's pile of gifts reached nearly to her waist. Boxes wrapped in beautiful paper ribbons and bows, more presents than one child could possibly need. My pile had 3 small packages. One was socks, another was a notebook for school, the third was a gift card for $10 to a store I never shopped at. I sat there watching Tracy open present after present while I finished in 2 minutes. No one seemed to notice the disparity. No one thought it was strange. I turned slightly enough to see their reflections in the dark glass. My father stood rigid, his earlier attempts at contrition abandoned. My mother had pressed a hand to her mouth. Tracy stared at the floor. "Do you remember when I was filling out college applications?" I asked. "I did every single one alone. I researched schools by myself, wrote essays by myself, gathered transcripts and recommendations by myself. Meanwhile, you drove Tracy to campus tours of schools she had no chance of attending, spending weekends at universities that would never accept her, treating her mediocre prospects like they deserved more attention than my actual opportunities. I had a genuine chance at good schools, and you could not be bothered to even read my applications. Each memory landed like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread through the silence of the room. I was not recounting these events to punish my family. I was recounting them because they had never been acknowledged, because I had carried their weight alone for decades, because speaking them aloud was the only way to finally set them down. I walked away from that house with $62, I said, my voice dropping lower. $62 and a bag of clothes and nothing else. I was 19 years old, and that was supposed to be my future. I spent the first week sleeping in my car because I could not afford a motel room. I skipped meals to stretch what little money I had, eating once a day, when I could manage it, sometimes going without entirely. I worked double shifts at a diner that paid minimum wage, standing on my feet for 16 hours until they bled, until I could barely walk home. I turned to face them fully now, wanting them to see my expression as I spoke these truths. "You know what kept me going during those months?" I asked. "Not hope that you would come find me. I abandoned that fantasy before the bus even left the station. Not dreams of reconciliation, of some future where we would be a real family. I knew that would never happen. What kept me going was something much simpler and much more painful." My voice remained steady, but I felt my hands trembling slightly at my sides. I needed to prove I was not worthless. I needed to prove that everything you believed about me was wrong. That was it. That was the fuel that got me through 18-hour days and empty refrigerators and loneliness so profound I sometimes forgot what my own voice sounded like. Pure burning determination to prove that I was not the nothing you told me I was. The silence in the room had become absolute. No one moved. No one seemed to breathe. I was not entirely alone, though I continued shifting my tone slightly. Walter Masterson found me, or maybe I should say he recognized me. He saw something in me that none of you ever noticed potential, that none of you ever nurtured. But his interest was not purely random. I turned to look directly at my father, whose face had begun to pale. Walter knew our surname, Webb. He recognized it immediately when I introduced myself at that diner, though he did not tell me why until years later. My father's hands had begun trembling again, more violently than before. 20 years ago, I said slowly, deliberately, a real estate broker named Richard Webb approached Walter Masterson with a property deal. The deal looked legitimate. The documents appeared proper. Walter invested significant money based on representations this broker made. And then he discovered that the documents had been forged. The deal was fraudulent. The broker had swindled him out of enough money to nearly bankrupt his company during a critical period of expansion. I watched my father's face contort through expressions I recognized from my own childhood. The desperate search for excuses, the calculations about how to escape accountability, the resentment at being caught. "Walter sued," I continued. "He won. The broker lost his license and his reputation. But Walter never forgot the name. He investigated that family over the years, curious about what kind of people could produce such a dishonest man. And then one night at a diner in Denver, he met that man's daughter." The room was utterly silent. My mother had turned to stare at my father with an expression of horrified recognition, pieces falling into place that perhaps she had always suspected but never confirmed. Tracy looked bewildered, clearly learning for the first time that our father's professional downfall had not been the result of bad luck and corrupt competitors. Walter told me everything I said, holding my father's gaze. He explained how you lied to him, how you forged documents, how you nearly destroyed everything he had built. And then he told me why he decided to invest in me anyway. He said that saving me was his way of proving that our family could produce something good, that talent and character could emerge even from poisoned soil. I paused, letting the weight of Walter's judgment settle over the room. The question I have asked myself many times since then, I continued, is whether Walter invested in the right person, whether I am actually different from you, or whether I am simply better at hiding the same fundamental dishonesty. My father's voice cracked when he finally spoke. I can explain. He started the words tumbling out with desperate urgency. It was not like that. The situation was more complicated than Walter understood. I was under pressure. I made mistakes, but I never meant to. I raised my hand, and he stopped mid-sentence. I am not finished, I said quietly, and my father's mouth closed. The silence following my raised hand lasted only seconds before my family's desperation overwhelmed whatever restraint remained. They had tried manipulation and emotional appeals and manufactured contrition, and none of it had worked. Now cornered and exposed, they abandoned pretense entirely and revealed themselves as they truly were. My father recovered first, his expression hardening from desperate guilt into something far more familiar, self-righteous anger. The apologetic posture he had adopted earlier disappeared, replaced by the rigid bearing of a man who believed the world owed him more than it had delivered. Fine, he snapped, his voice sharp with barely contained fury. We were not perfect parents, I admit that. Maybe we made mistakes, maybe we could have done things differently. But you owe us, Danielle. We raised you, we fed you, we put a roof over your head for 18 years. You think you got where you are entirely alone? Everything you have, everything you built, started with us. His voice rose as he warmed to this argument conviction, replacing contrition with disturbing speed. We sacrificed for you, he continued, apparently forgetting that the primary sacrifice he remembered was my refusal to sacrifice my own savings for Tracy's debt. We gave you a foundation to build on. The least you can do is share some of that wealth with the people who made you who you are. The entitlement in his words hung in the air like poison. In his mind, the 18 years of neglect and favoritism and emotional abandonment had been transformed into a gift for which I owed repayment. The fact that I had fled his house with $62 while he funded Tracy's failed business ventures had been erased from his accounting. He had contributed nothing to my success except the determination to escape him, and yet he stood before me demanding compensation as though he were an investor claiming dividends. My mother recognized that my father's approach was failing and pivoted to a different strategy. Her desperation manifested as guilt-tripping, a technique she had wielded skillfully throughout my childhood to ensure my compliance with whatever the family needed. Danielle, you need to think about the consequences of your decisions, she said, her voice dropping into a tone of dark warning. Your father is not young anymore. If he loses the house, if he has to face that kind of stress and humiliation at his age, it could kill him. He could have a heart attack. Is that what you want? To be responsible for your father's death? She paused to let this threat settle before continuing. And Tracy, she added, gesturing toward my sister. She is fragile, Danielle. More fragile than you know. If she loses her job because of some corporate decision, if she finds herself with nothing after everything she has worked for, I do not know what she might do to herself. Is that what you want? To destroy your own family? To have their suffering on your conscience? The manipulation was so transparent it almost made me laugh. Help us, she was saying, or bear responsibility for whatever happens. If my father's health failed, it would be my fault for not preventing it. If Tracy harmed herself, I would be to blame for not protecting her. Never mind that their circumstances resulted from their own choices, their own dishonesty, their own decades of poor decisions. In my mother's framework, I was responsible for rescuing them from consequences I had no part in creating. It was the same technique she had used throughout my childhood, guilting me into sacrifice by suggesting that my failure to comply would cause suffering I would then own. I had fallen for it countless times as a girl. I would not fall for it now. Tracy had been building toward her own explosion while our parents made their appeals, and now she erupted with fury that startled even them. "This is not fair!" she shouted, her voice cracking with rage. "I worked hard my whole life while you just got lucky. Some old rich man takes pity on you and suddenly you are better than everyone." She gestured wildly at the magnificent suite surrounding us, at the evidence of success she could not accept I had earned. "You did not build this," she screamed. "You did not earn any of it. You manipulated some lonely old man into giving you everything. That is the only way someone like you could have succeeded. You are a fraud, Danielle, a fraud who got lucky and now thinks she is superior to the people who actually worked for what they have." The projection was breathtaking. Tracy, who had embezzled marketing funds and falsified reports and bullied employees, was accusing me of dishonesty. Tracy, who had manipulated our parents and sabotaged my scholarship and built her entire career on charm rather than competence, was accusing me of not earning my success. She was describing herself and attributing those qualities to me, unable to comprehend that someone could achieve through genuine effort what she had failed to achieve through shortcuts. I let their outbursts fade into silence. The suite felt very still after the shouting, the luxury surrounding us unchanged by the ugliness that had filled the air. My father stood breathing heavily, his self-righteous anger having exhausted him. My mother watched me with calculating eyes, still hoping her guilt trip might take delayed effect. Tracy trembled with fury she could not contain, her face flushed and her hands clenched at her sides. I looked at each of them slowly, allowing the silence to stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then I spoke. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. "Because now we are going to discuss what happens next." The question hung in the air, my quiet authority filling the space where their shouting had echoed moments before. I gestured toward the seating area of the suite where elegant sofas and chairs formed a conversation grouping around a polished coffee table. My family moved hesitantly, uncertain what to expect, their earlier aggression deflated by my composure. I sat down across from them, my posture straight and professional, the same bearing I adopted in boardrooms when negotiating significant deals. This was in many ways the most important negotiation of my life, and I intended to conduct it with the discipline that had carried me through every challenge I had faced. "I want to be clear about something," I began, my voice calm and measured. "I am not refusing to help you. Despite everything that has happened, despite every cruelty you have inflicted and every manipulation you have attempted tonight, I am not refusing to offer assistance." I saw hope flicker across their faces, quickly masked but unmistakable. However, I continued, "I am also not going to enable you. I am not going to write a check that allows you to continue the patterns of behavior that created this situation. If you want my assistance, there will be conditions, non-negotiable conditions." I reached into the clutch I had carried throughout the evening and produced a folder I had prepared in advance of this dinner. Inside were documents I had drafted with the help of my legal team agreements that outlined exactly what I was willing to offer and what I required in return. "These are not punishments," I said, placing the folder on the coffee table between us. "They are requirements for people who genuinely want to rebuild their lives instead of continuing the patterns that led to this moment. If you are sincere about wanting help, these terms will not seem unreasonable. If you are only interested in extracting money with no intention of changing, then we have nothing further to discuss." I opened the folder and removed the first set of documents, sliding them toward my parents. "For both of you," I said, addressing my mother and father together. "Mandatory financial counseling for a minimum of 1 year. You will work with a professional advisor who will teach you how to budget, how to live within your means, how to plan for the future instead of lurching from crisis to crisis." My father's expression darkened, but I continued before he could interrupt. "You will sell the house. It is too large, too expensive, and maintaining it has been draining resources you do not have. You will move into something modest and affordable, something appropriate for your actual financial situation, rather than the image you have been trying to project. I paused, looking directly at my father. And you will stop gambling. His face went pale. My mother turned to stare at him with an expression of shocked recognition, another secret apparently confirmed. Yes, I said quietly. I know about the gambling. I know about the casino visits you hid from Mom, about the online poker accounts, about the money that disappeared into bets you convinced yourself would solve all your problems. That stops completely. No exceptions, no slip-ups, no one-more-chance rationalizations. I let that settle before continuing. If you agree to these conditions and follow through consistently, you will receive enough money to clear your debts and establish a modest retirement fund. Nothing extravagant. Enough to live comfortably if you manage it responsibly. How you handle things from there is your responsibility. My father opened his mouth to protest, but I cut him off without raising my voice. These terms are not negotiable. Accept them or do not. The choice is yours. I turned to Tracy, who had been watching this exchange with growing apprehension. From the folder, I removed a different document and placed it on the table in front of her. For you, I said, the situation is more complicated. You are currently employed by a company I own. Your performance in that role has been documented extensively by Human Resources, and the documentation is damning. Tracy's face lost what little color remained. Embezzlement of marketing funds, harassment of subordinates resulting in 14 formal complaints, falsification of performance reports to hide declining metrics. These are not allegations. These are documented facts with evidence sufficient to support both termination for cause and potential criminal prosecution. I slid the termination letter toward her. This was prepared before tonight. Your employment with Masterson Hotels is ending regardless of what happens in this room. Tracy stared at the letter without touching it, as though the paper itself might burn her. However, I continued, I am prepared to offer you an alternative to simply being escorted out and blacklisted from the industry. You can begin again at entry level, housekeeping at a property far from here where no one knows your history. You will work your way up honestly, demonstrating genuine competence and genuine change over a period of 3 years. If you succeed, if you prove that you can function as a professional without cheating or bullying or manipulating, there may be opportunities for advancement. I held her gaze steadily. You will earn your way back. No shortcuts, no connections, no favors from your sister, the chairwoman. Just work. Real work, the kind you have never actually done. Tracy's mouth opened and closed, but no words emerged. The termination letter sat on the table between us, its implications impossible to deny. I closed the folder and placed it beside the other documents. If you agree to these terms, I said, looking at each of them in turn, sign the agreements. I will honor my commitments, and I expect you to honor yours. I paused, letting the weight of what came next settle over the room. If you do not agree, if these conditions are unacceptable to you, then this conversation is over. This is the last time we will ever speak, and you will face the consequences of your choices without any assistance from me. The ultimatum settled over the room like a weight none of them had anticipated. My parents exchanged glances heavy with unspoken communication calculations happening behind their eyes as they weighed the costs of compliance against the consequences of refusal. But it was Tracy whose reaction demanded attention. Tracy, whose carefully maintained facade finally cracked beyond repair. She stared at the termination letter on the table, at the agreements outlining conditions she clearly found humiliating, and something inside her simply broke. The composed professional persona she had projected throughout the evening, already damaged by the revelation of my identity, collapsed entirely. What emerged from the wreckage was raw and ugly and more honest than anything I had ever heard from my sister. "You want to know the truth," she screamed, her voice cracking with an intensity that made our parents flinch backward. "You want to know what I really think, what I have always thought." She stood abruptly, knocking her chair backward, her hands trembling at her sides. "I have hated you my entire life, Danielle. Hated you. From the moment I was old enough to understand anything, I hated you." The words poured out in a torrent that seemed beyond her control, years of suppressed emotion finally finding release. "You were always smarter than me, always more capable, always working harder, achieving more, doing everything better. Mom and Dad praised me, constantly told me I was special, treated me like I was the golden child. But I knew. I always knew the truth. You were better than me in every way that actually mattered. She laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and broken. I had to believe you were worthless. Do you understand? I had to convince myself that you were nothing, that you would never amount to anything, because if I admitted the truth, then what did that make me? The praised daughter who could not actually compete with the ignored one, the special child who was actually inferior to the forgotten sister. The raw honesty was stunning in its ugliness. I had suspected Tracy's jealousy ran deep, but I had never imagined she would articulate it so explicitly, would confess to the psychological mechanism that had driven her cruelty for 3 decades. Then her voice dropped the screaming, giving way to something quieter and somehow more devastating. The scholarship, she whispered, and I felt my body go still. Tracy looked at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. The Cornell Hotel School Scholarship. When you were 17, the acceptance letter came in the mail when you were at work. My heart began pounding in my chest. I had applied for that scholarship in secret, had poured my hopes into an application I never told anyone about. When no response ever came, I assumed I had been rejected, that my dreams of escaping through education had been foolish from the start. I read it. Tracy continued, her voice breaking on each word. Full ride, 4 years, everything paid. They wanted you, Danielle. They saw something in your application, in your essays, in your grades. They wanted to give you everything you needed to succeed. She finally looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I destroyed it. I burned it in the backyard when no one was home. I watched it turn to ash and told myself you did not deserve it, that you would fail anyway, that I was protecting you from disappointment. But that was a lie. I stole your future because I could not stand the thought of watching you succeed. I could not bear the idea of you escaping while I stayed trapped in a life where the only thing that made me special was being compared favorably to you. The room went absolutely silent. My parents stared at Tracy with expressions of horror, apparently learning for the first time that their golden child had committed this act of sabotage. The confession hung in the air, irrefutable and devastating. Tracy collapsed back into a chair, sobs racking her body. And the worst part, she choked out between gasps for air. You still succeeded, without Cornell, without any of us, without a single advantage or connection or helping hand from this family. You became everything I was supposed to be. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes filled with a desperation I had never seen before. What was it all for? She asked, her voice small and broken. All the lying, all the scheming, all the hatred I carried for 30 years. None of it stopped you. None of it even slowed you down. You won anyway. So what was any of it for? I absorbed the confession in silence, feeling something shift inside me that I had not anticipated. The wound Tracy described, the stolen scholarship, the sabotaged future, had been a source of unspoken grief for years. I had never known what happened to that application had assumed my own inadequacy explained the rejection. Learning the truth should have ignited fury. Instead, I felt the old wound tear open and then strangely begin to close. The path Tracy tried to destroy had led somewhere even better. Without Cornell, I had found Lucky's Diner. Without the traditional route, I had found Walter Masterson. Without the advantages Tracy stole, I had built something far greater than any Ivy League degree could have guaranteed. The irony was almost poetic. "How do you not hate me?" Tracy whispered, searching my face for the rage she expected to find. "How are you not screaming at me right now? After everything I did, after everything I took from you, how can you just sit there?" I let her questions fade into the heavy silence of the room. Then I leaned forward slightly and asked a question of my own, my voice quiet, but carrying clearly through the space between us. "Do you know who actually owns the hotel chain you work for? Not just this property, the whole chain, all 83 hotels. Do you know who signs off on every major decision, including personnel matters, at every level of the organization?" The question landed with the precision I had intended, cutting through Tracy's emotional turmoil and forcing her to confront a reality she had somehow never considered. I watched comprehension dawn on her face. watched her mind connect the pieces she should have assembled long ago. No, she breathed the word barely audible. The whole chain. I nodded slowly, allowing her time to absorb the full implications. 83 properties, I confirmed. Every hotel that bears the Masterson name, every employee who works under that brand, every decision about expansion, renovation, staffing, and termination. All of it ultimately reports to me. Tracy's face had gone completely white. I continued driving the point deeper. The hotel you manage, the position you have built your entire identity around, exists because I allow it to exist. The career you have spent years constructing, the title you have used to feel superior to everyone around you, only happened because channels of authority you never bothered to investigate happened to lead to your sister. I let that settle before adding the detail that seemed to affect her most profoundly. Every promotion you received was approved through processes that ultimately reported to me. Regional directors recommended you human resources processed the paperwork, but the final authority for management appointments has always been mine. I could have blocked any advancement you attempted. I chose not to because I did not even know you were in the system until 18 months ago. You have been dancing in my shadow your entire career without ever realizing the shadow existed. Tracy looked physically ill, her earlier sobs replaced by a stillness that suggested she might actually be sick. The superiority she had projected throughout the evening, the pride she had taken in her Masterson management position, all of it had been built on ignorance. She had spent years feeling accomplished in a role that existed only because her dismissed sister had not noticed her presence in the organization. "There is more," I said, and Tracy flinched as though anticipating a physical blow. "I have known about your management problems for 18 months. Since the moment I discovered your name in our personnel files, I have been receiving reports about your performance. The embezzlement from marketing budgets, the harassment complaints, 14 formal grievances from employees you bullied so severely they felt compelled to document their experiences. The fabricated performance metrics you submitted to hide the fact that your property was declining under your leadership." Tracy's eyes widened with each item I listed, her expression shifting from shock to horror as she understood how thoroughly I had monitored her failures. "Legal prepared your termination package 6 months ago?" I continued. "The documentation was complete. The evidence was irrefutable. You were going to be fired, escorted out by security, and potentially prosecuted for the embezzlement. Your career in hospitality was going to end, and your name was going to be blacklisted across the industry." I paused, watching her process this information. I delayed the decision. I told Legal and Human Resources to hold the termination while I considered the situation. "Do you know why?" Tracy shook her head, mutely, apparently unable to speak. "Because I wanted to understand. I wanted to comprehend what could possibly transform my sister into someone capable of stealing from her employer, terrorizing her subordinates, and lying systematically to cover her failures. I kept hoping there would be some explanation, some context that would make sense of the person you had become. Tonight was supposed to provide that understanding." I gestured at the room around us, at the evidence of the trap Tracy had constructed. "Instead, I discovered that you knew who I was, that you deliberately orchestrated this dinner to humiliate me, that your cruelty was not some unfortunate side effect of professional pressure, but a fundamental expression of who you have always been." Tracy's defiance, already crumbling, collapsed entirely into pleading. "I did not know it was you," she said desperately, her voice climbing with panic. "When I was doing those things at work, I had no idea you were watching. If I had known you owned the company, you would have what I interrupted quietly. Been nicer to the employees you terrorized. Stopped stealing money that did not belong to you. Told the truth instead of fabricating reports to cover your incompetence." Tracy's mouth opened, but no response emerged. "The fact that you only regret your actions now," I continued, "now that you know I hold power over your career and your freedom, tells me everything I need to know about who you have become. You are not sorry for what you did. You are sorry that someone with authority finally noticed. You are sorry that there are consequences. That is not remorse. That is fear." I slid the termination letter across the table until it sat directly in front of her. "This was waiting for you regardless of tonight. The question that remains is whether you are capable of becoming someone different, whether the person sitting in front of me has any capacity for genuine change, or whether you are so fundamentally committed to shortcuts and cruelty that rehabilitation is impossible. Tracy stared at the document at the official letterhead and the formal language that would end her career, and I saw something shift in her expression. The terror remained, but beneath it emerged a different kind of fear, one that seemed directed not at me, but at our parents, who had been watching this exchange in frozen silence. She looked up from the letter, her eyes red and swollen, and asked a question that revealed where her priorities truly lay. "What about Mom and Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you going to tell them about their precious golden child now?" Tracy's question about our parents hung in the air, but my attention had shifted to my father. He had been uncharacteristically quiet since I revealed Walter Masterson's connection to our family, since I exposed the fraud that had defined and destroyed his career 20 years ago. Throughout Tracy's breakdown and confession, throughout the revelations about her professional misconduct, he had sat in rigid silence, his face unreadable, but his hands trembling against his knees. Now, watching his golden child crumble under the weight of her own failures, something in him finally broke as well. The patriarchal mask he had worn for decades began to dissolve. The stern provider, the decisive leader, the man who was never wrong, who never admitted fault, who maintained authority through intimidation rather than earning respect through character. That mask, carefully constructed and ruthlessly maintained, simply fell away. Tears began streaming down his face. Not the performative emotion my mother had attempted earlier, not manipulation designed to achieve a specific outcome. These were the tears of a man confronting truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding, a dam finally giving way under pressure it could no longer contain. "I never thought you would amount to anything," he said, his voice cracking on almost every word. His eyes met mine with an honesty I had never seen in them before. "Not because you were incapable. I knew you were smart. I knew you worked harder than anyone in our family. I knew you had potential that Tracy would never match." He paused, struggling to force the next words out. "I dismissed you because I could not stand the idea that you might surpass me, that my daughter, the one I had decided was worthless, might achieve more than I ever had. My ego could not tolerate that possibility, so I convinced myself it would never happen. I convinced myself you were nothing because I needed you to be nothing." The confession was devastating in its simplicity. He had not failed to see my potential through ignorance or blindness. He had deliberately refused to acknowledge it, because doing so would have threatened his sense of superiority. He had chosen to diminish me rather than face his own inadequacy. But there was more. I could see it building in his expression, something he had been carrying that weighed even heavier than the admission of jealousy. "I am dying," he said. The words fell into the silence of the room like stones into still water. My mother gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Tracy's sobs stopped abruptly as she stared at our father with shock that seemed genuine. "Stage 3. Pancreatic cancer," he continued, his voice hollow. "Diagnosed 4 months ago. The doctors say I have maybe a year, probably less. Treatment might extend that, but it will not cure anything." My mother's gasp turned into a strangled sob. "4 months," she whispered. "You have known for 4 months and you did not tell me the full extent." My father could not meet her eyes. "I told you it was serious." I could not bring myself to say how serious. He turned back to me, and I saw something in his expression I had never witnessed before: genuine vulnerability. "I did not want this dinner to ask for money," he said, his voice breaking repeatedly as he spoke. "The financial problems are real, yes, but that is not why I wrote to you. I needed." He could not finish the sentence. The words seemed to stick in his throat, blocked by decades of pride and stubbornness that even the approach of death could not entirely overcome. But I understood. I understood with the clarity that comes from knowing someone for 33 years, even when that knowing was characterized by pain rather than love. He was terrified of dying without reconciliation. He wanted to see his daughter one more time, wanted some form of connection before the end came. But his pride would not allow him to simply say that. He could not admit to needing me, to wanting my presence in his final months, so he had wrapped that need in the familiar framework of family obligation and financial crisis. Everything, the invitation, the elaborate dinner, the insistence on gathering together, had been his desperate attempt to create an opportunity he could not bring himself to request directly. I absorbed the news in silence, feeling something complicated move through me. There was the familiar pull toward comfort, toward forgiveness, toward being the accommodating daughter I had been trained to be for 18 years. Part of me wanted to rush to his side to tell him everything would be fine, to give him the reconciliation he was seeking without requiring anything in return. Then I remembered. I remembered being called worthless. I remembered being demanded to sacrifice my college savings for Tracy's failures. I remembered 18 years of invisibility, followed by 14 years of abandonment. I remembered every birthday forgotten, every achievement ignored, every moment when this man could have chosen to be my father and instead chose to be my critic. "I am sorry you are sick," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. "I mean that sincerely. No one deserves to face what you are facing, and I would not wish this on anyone." He looked up with something like hope in his eyes, but I was not finished. "But illness does not erase 33 years of choosing Tracy over me. It does not undo the damage you caused or the wounds you inflicted. It does not automatically entitle you to the reconciliation you should have sought years ago when you were healthy and had time to do the work." I held his gaze, refusing to look away. "If you want to be my father now, you will have to earn it. Starting today, not with words or apologies or confessions delivered under the pressure of mortality, with actions, with genuine change, with the hard work of becoming someone worthy of the relationship you are asking for." My father nodded slowly, tears continuing to stream down his weathered face. He did not argue. He did not protest that my terms were unfair or that his illness should grant him special consideration. He simply nodded, accepting conditions he would have rejected furiously at any other point in his life. And for the first time, I saw him not as my oppressor, not as the man who had made me feel worthless for 3 decades, but as a broken old man running out of time. The image of my father as a broken old man stayed with me as I turned my attention to my mother. She had been largely silent throughout the most devastating revelations of the evening, watching her husband confess his jealousy and his illness, watching her golden child crumble under the weight of exposed failures. Now she sat apart from both of them, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her expression carrying the exhausted weight of someone preparing to release a burden carried far too long. "There is something you should know," she said, her voice flat with resignation. She did not meet my eyes as she spoke, instead, focusing on some point on the floor between us. "Something I should have told you years ago, but never found the courage to say." I waited in silence, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "When you were 17, she began. Your father made me sign papers, legal documents that transferred everything we owned, the house, the savings accounts, everything of value, into Tracy's name." She paused, her hands tightening against each other. I did not want to sign them. I argued with him about it, but he insisted. He said you were too independent to need an inheritance, that you would make your own way regardless. He said Tracy would always need protection, would always need support, and we had to ensure she was taken care of. She finally looked up, meeting my eyes with an expression that mingled shame and sorrow in equal measure. "I was a coward," she said simply. "I knew it was wrong. I knew we were treating our daughters unequally in the most fundamental way possible. But I signed the papers anyway because fighting Richard was exhausting, and because part of me believed him when he said you did not need us. I am sorry." The revelation explained something I had never understood: why there had been nothing for me when I left, why the family resources had never been mentioned as a possibility for my future. I had been legally written out of any inheritance at 17 before I even knew there was something to inherit. But my mother was not finished. The confession about the papers seemed to have opened a door she could no longer close, and deeper truths began spilling through. "I was jealous of you, Danielle," she said, and the admission seemed to cost her physically. Her shoulders curved inward, as though protecting herself from the weight of her own words. When I was your age, I had dreams. I wanted to be someone to achieve something meaningful with my life, but I gave it all up. Marriage, motherhood, the path I thought was expected of me. I convinced myself it was the right choice, that fulfillment would come from supporting my husband and raising my children. Her voice trembled as she continued. And then I watched you refuse to make the same choice. I watched you hold on to your dreams despite everything we did to discourage them. You had the courage. I never found the determination to pursue your own path regardless of what anyone thought or wanted. Tears had begun forming in her eyes, though she made no move to wipe them away. I punished you for being the woman I was too afraid to become. Every time I praised Tracy over you, every time I dismissed your achievements, every time I told you that Tracy had a future while you would just manage, I was really trying to convince myself that I had made the right choices, that giving up my dreams had been worth it, that you were wrong to want more than I had settled for. The psychological insight was painful in its clarity. My mother had not simply favored Tracy out of preference. She had actively worked to suppress me because my ambition reflected her own abandoned hopes, because my determination highlighted her capitulation. But her final confession cut deepest of all. I knew about the scholarship letter, she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I saw Tracy burn it in the backyard. My composure, maintained through so much of this evening, finally cracked. I felt my breath catch, felt something shift in my chest at the confirmation that both my mother and sister had conspired to destroy my opportunity. I told myself it was for the best. My mother continued, tears now streaming freely down her face. I convinced myself that if you got that scholarship, you would leave and never come back. I thought that if you stayed close to home, if you did not have that escape route, we would eventually be a real family. I thought we had more time to fix things. She shook her head slowly, the full weight of her miscalculation evident in her expression. We never thought you would survive without us. Your father and I both believed you would struggle, fail, come crawling back, and finally accept your place in this family. But you did not just survive. You became everything we tried to stop you from being. Everything I gave up on for myself, you achieved for yourself, and I have had to live with knowing that I helped sabotage my own daughter's future because I was too afraid to confront my own failures. The admission hung in the air like a ghost finally given voice, the truth of 3 decades condensed into a confession that could never fully atone for the damage done. I sat in silence for a long moment, processing this final revelation. My mother had known. She had watched Tracy destroy my scholarship and said nothing done. Nothing allowed it to happen because keeping me trapped seemed preferable to letting me fly. What do you want from me now? I finally asked, my voice quiet but steady, despite everything I had just learned. After everything you have told me, after all the ways you helped ensure I would fail, what do you actually want from me? My mother's answer to my question was silence. She had no response prepared, no manipulation ready, nothing but the hollow emptiness of someone who had finally run out of strategies. I looked at my father still quietly weeping in his chair, and at Tracy curled into herself on the sofa like a child awaiting punishment. They had confessed everything. They had emptied themselves of secrets and schemes and decades of buried truths, and now they waited for me to pronounce judgment. I need time alone, I said, rising from my seat. I need to think. No one protested as I walked toward the terrace doors. I stepped outside into the cold December air, pulling the glass closed behind me and leaving my family in the warmth of the suite they could never have afforded on their own. The city spread out before me like a map of everything I had built. Lights glittered in the darkness, each one representing someone living their life, pursuing their dreams, struggling through their own private battles. From this height, the world looked manageable, comprehensible, a landscape I had learned to navigate through years of discipline and determination. I had conquered so much, but the battle raging inside me now felt more difficult than any corporate challenge I had ever faced. I thought about Walter, about the conversations we had shared during those formative years when he was teaching me not just how to run a business, but how to be a leader. One evening, after I had handled a particularly frustrating negotiation with unnecessary harshness, he had pulled me aside and offered wisdom that stayed with me ever since. "The greatest leaders know when to let go of anger," he had said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience, not for the sake of those who wronged them, for themselves. Anger is a chain, Danielle. It binds you to the people you resent. The only way to truly be free is to set it down. I had carried my family's rejection like a stone in my chest for 14 years. It had motivated me, driven me, fueled the relentless determination that built my career. But it had also weighed on me in ways I rarely acknowledged, shaping my choices, influencing my relationships, keeping me isolated behind walls I constructed to prevent anyone from hurting me the way they had. Tonight, that weight had transformed. The confessions I had heard, the secrets finally exposed, the truth finally spoken aloud, none of it erased the pain of my childhood. But something had shifted. The burden felt different now, changed into something I could finally set down if I chose to. I considered my options with the analytical clarity I brought to every major decision. I had power here, absolute power. I could use that power for revenge, could expose Tracy publicly to ensure her disgrace was complete and permanent. I could let my parents lose their home, watch them face the consequences of their poor choices without any assistance from me. I could ensure they experienced the same helplessness and desperation they had made me feel when I walked out of their house with $62 and no future. Part of me wanted this. The wounded girl who still lived somewhere inside me wanted them to suffer, wanted them to understand through direct experience what their cruelty had cost. They deserved consequences. Everything they had confessed tonight confirmed that their treatment of me had been deliberate, calculated, chosen. Justice would look like letting them fall. But another part of me, the part Walter had nurtured and developed, understood something the wounded girl could not see. If I used my power for cruelty, if I became someone who destroyed others because she had the ability to do so, I would be exactly what they had always accused me of being. I would be selfish and cold and incapable of family feeling. I would become them, perpetuating the cycle of harm that had defined the Webb family for generations. That was a price too high for any revenge. I made my decision standing on that terrace, looking out at the city I had conquered. I would help them, but not in the way they expected. I would offer them a path out of their circumstances, genuine assistance that could transform their lives if they committed to the work. But they would have to walk that path themselves. Every step would require effort, change, growth. The assistance would come with accountability. The opportunity would demand they become better people than they had ever been. This was not forgiveness in any traditional sense. I was not absolving them of wrongdoing or pretending the past had not happened. This was something harder than forgiveness. This was choosing to release the hold they had on my heart while still requiring them to earn any relationship they wanted with me. This was refusing to let their cruelty define my character while also refusing to enable their continued dysfunction. Whether they found redemption was up to them. Whether they did the work, made the changes, became people worthy of reconciliation. Those choices belonged to them entirely. I would provide the opportunity. They would determine the outcome. Either way, I would be free. I took one last breath of cold air, feeling the December wind against my face, and turned back toward the suite. Through the glass doors, I could see my family sitting exactly where I had left them, frozen in uncertainty, waiting to learn their fate. I opened the door and stepped inside, letting the warmth envelop me as 3 pairs of eyes turned toward me with desperate hope and barely concealed fear. "I have made my decision," I said, my voice calm and clear. "But first I need you to understand something." The 3 of them watched me with expressions that mingled hope and dread in equal measure. I remained standing, understanding that the physical dynamic of this moment mattered. They were seated, waiting. I was standing, deciding. The power differential was clear, and I intended it to be. "What you need to understand," I began, "is that what I am about to offer is not what any of you expected or probably wanted. It is not a blank check. It is not unconditional forgiveness. It is not a return to some fantasy of family harmony that never actually existed. What I am offering is an opportunity, nothing more and nothing less. What you do with that opportunity is entirely up to you." I walked to the coffee table where the folder still lay from earlier in the evening and removed a final document I had not yet shown them. This was the culmination of everything, the formal expression of the decision I had made on the terrace. "This is a written commitment," I said, placing the document on the table where all three could see it. "It is not a legal contract. It is not enforceable in any court. If you sign it, you are committing to these conditions voluntarily as a matter of personal integrity and moral obligation. There are no lawyers who will hold you to these terms. There is only me." I looked at each of them in turn, ensuring they understood the weight of what I was saying. "If you sign this agreement and then violate its conditions, our relationship ends permanently. There will be no second chances, no renegotiation, no appeals to family loyalty or shared history. I will remove myself from your lives completely, and you will face whatever consequences await you without any assistance or involvement from me. This is not a threat. It is simply the boundary I am establishing. You can choose to accept it or not." My father leaned forward to look at the document, his hands still trembling slightly, but his expression showing something that might have been respect. My mother remained motionless, watching me rather than the paper. Tracy stared at the table as though afraid to see what the commitment contained. I outlined the terms methodically, ensuring there could be no confusion or misinterpretation. "For you," I said, addressing my parents together, "the conditions are as follows. Mandatory financial counseling for a minimum of 18 months. You will work with an advisor of my choosing, someone who will teach you to live within your means and plan responsibly for the future. You will attend every session and complete every assignment. There are no exceptions." My father nodded slowly, apparently having accepted that this requirement was non-negotiable. "You will sell the house," I continued. "It is too large, too expensive, and maintaining it has contributed significantly to your financial problems. You will purchase or rent something modest and appropriate for your actual circumstances. The proceeds from the sale, after debts are cleared, will be placed in a managed account that will fund your living expenses according to a budget the financial counselor establishes." My mother's face tightened at this condition, but she said nothing. "You will be completely honest with me and with each other about your circumstances going forward. No more hidden gambling, no more secret debts, no more manipulation or schemes or attempts to extract resources through guilt or obligation. If I discover that you have lied to me about anything significant, the agreement is void and our relationship ends." I paused to let these terms settle before adding the final condition for my parents. "And if you want any relationship with me, you will demonstrate through consistent action that you value me as a person, not as a resource. You will ask about my life and actually listen to the answers. You will acknowledge the harm you caused and work actively to repair it. You will treat me as your daughter, not as an obligation or an opportunity. This is not optional. This is the minimum requirement for any ongoing connection." I turned my attention to Tracy, whose face had grown increasingly pale as she listened to the conditions imposed on our parents. She knew her own terms would be more demanding, and the fear in her expression suggested she had begun imagining what they might entail. "For you," I said, "your situation is more complicated because it involves both family matters and professional misconduct. The two cannot be entirely separated." Tracy swallowed hard but said nothing. "You will be officially terminated from your position for cause. The documentation exists, the evidence is clear, and there is no version of this story where you remain employed at that property. Human Resources will process your termination within the week, and your name will be flagged in our system as ineligible for rehire at the management level." Tracy's breath caught audibly, but I continued without pause. "However, I am offering you an alternative to prosecution for the embezzlement. My legal team believes we have sufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges. I am choosing not to pursue that route provided you accept the following conditions." The relief that flickered across Tracy's face was premature. What came next would test whether she truly wanted redemption or merely wanted to escape consequences. "You will begin again at entry level. Housekeeping at a property in another region where no one knows your history or your connection to me. You will work your way up legitimately, earning every promotion through demonstrated competence and genuine growth. This process will take a minimum of 3 years. There are no shortcuts, no accelerated timelines, no special treatment because you are my sister." Tracy's mouth opened as if to protest, but I raised my hand and she fell silent. You will attend regular therapy sessions with a professional who specializes in patterns of jealousy, competition, and workplace behavior. You will address the underlying issues that led you to treat employees cruelly and to make the choices that destroyed your career. The therapy is not optional, and I will receive progress reports from your counselor. I delivered the final condition with particular emphasis. Most importantly, you will write formal letters of apology to every employee you mistreated. Every person who filed a complaint against you, every subordinate you bullied or harassed, every colleague whose work environment you poisoned with your behavior. These letters will acknowledge specifically what you did, take full responsibility without excuses, and express genuine remorse. The letters will be reviewed by Human Resources before being sent to ensure they meet acceptable standards. The room had grown very quiet. My family sat in stunned silence, processing the full scope of what I was requiring. "This is humiliating," Tracy finally said, her voice small but carrying an edge of the old defiance. "Starting over as a housekeeper, I have a business degree. I was a manager. You want me to clean toilets and change sheets like some kind of servant?" I met her eyes with calm steadiness. "You have a business degree that you used to embezzle funds and falsify reports. You were a manager who terrorized subordinates and created a hostile work environment. Your credentials and your title did not make you a good person or a competent professional. They gave you authority you abused and opportunities you squandered." I leaned forward slightly, ensuring my next words landed with full impact. "You have a pattern of failure, deception, and cruelty that extends back decades. This is not punishment, Tracy. This is an opportunity to become someone different, someone capable of earning success legitimately, rather than manipulating and cheating your way to positions you cannot actually handle. Take the opportunity or do not. That choice belongs to you. But I will not enable the person you have been. I will not use my resources to protect you from consequences you created. If you want my help, this is the only form it will take." I placed 3 pens on the table beside the document, one positioned in front of each family member. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide. I will return at 9 o'clock. If you have signed the agreement, we begin the process I have outlined. If you have not signed, I will wish you well, and we will part ways permanently. There is no third option. There is no negotiation. This is what I am offering, and you must decide whether you want it." I stepped back from the table, giving them space to absorb what had just happened. The family exchanged glances, communicating silently in the way people do when they have known each other for decades. My father looked at my mother with something like acceptance. My mother looked at Tracy with concern. Tracy looked at the document with an expression caught between resentment and fear. They were beginning to understand. This was their final chance. Not to extract money or manipulate emotions or continue the patterns that had defined our family for 3 generations. This was their final chance to become people worthy of the relationship they claimed to want, and the cost of that redemption had just become terrifyingly real. They signed the agreement the following morning. I returned to the suite at precisely 9 o'clock and found all 3 documents bearing signatures, the pens placed neatly beside them. No one spoke as I collected the papers and reviewed each signature. My father's hand had trembled as he wrote his name. My mother's signature was small and tight, reflecting her reluctance. Tracy's looked like it had been written quickly, perhaps before she could change her mind. 6 months passed. The implementation of our agreement proved far more difficult than signing it had been. Tracy reported to a Masterson property in Arizona, far from anyone who knew her history, and began her new career in housekeeping. I received reports from her supervisor, a woman named Margaret, who had no idea why corporate headquarters was interested in the progress of one entry-level employee. The early reports were discouraging. Tracy bristled at every task, complained frequently, and seemed to view the work as beneath her dignity. Margaret noted that Tracy spent her breaks alone, that other housekeepers avoided her, and that her attitude created tension throughout the department. I read these reports with a mixture of disappointment and grim expectation. Part of me had known this would happen, had anticipated that Tracy's entitled mindset would resist the humility required by her new circumstances. I prepared myself for the possibility that she would quit or violate the agreement's terms, that the opportunity I had offered would be wasted on someone incapable of genuine change. But something unexpected happened during the third month. Margaret's reports began shifting in tone. Tracy had stopped complaining. She arrived on time, completed her assignments thoroughly, and started asking questions about how to improve her technique. Margaret noted that Tracy scrubbed toilets with tears streaming down her face, but she scrubbed them well. She made beds with precision that exceeded requirements. She began volunteering for tasks others avoided. More significantly, the social dynamics began changing. Coworkers who had initially avoided Tracy started acknowledging her presence. Brief greetings in hallways, nods of recognition in the break room. Nothing dramatic, but the isolation was lifting. Tracy was becoming slowly and painfully a member of a community rather than an outsider demanding special treatment. I did not know what to make of these changes. They could represent genuine transformation or merely better concealed manipulation. Tracy had fooled people before. She might simply be learning to perform humility while waiting for an opportunity to exploit. My parents' progress was equally complicated. They sold the oversized house that had been bleeding them financially for years and moved into a modest two-bedroom apartment in a less prestigious neighborhood. My mother complained about the smaller space, the lack of a proper dining room, the neighbors she considered beneath her social standing. My father said little, his energy increasingly consumed by cancer treatment and the therapy sessions I had required. I had quietly ensured that his medical insurance would cover the treatments he needed. I arranged this through intermediaries, using corporate resources in ways that could not be traced back to my personal intervention. He never knew that his daughter was the reason his chemotherapy was affordable, and I intended to keep it that way. If he thought my assistance came with invisible strings, it might taint whatever genuine change he was attempting. Something surprising emerged from my father's therapy sessions. He began writing me letters, not requests for money or complaints about his circumstances, but actual correspondence that shared memories, offered reflections, and attempted halting apologies for specific incidents from my childhood. The letters were imperfect, sometimes veering into self-justification or subtle blame-shifting, but they represented effort. They represented a man trying to understand himself and his failures in whatever time he had remaining. Some letters I answered brief responses that acknowledged his effort without offering premature forgiveness. Others I kept to read later when I felt strong enough to engage with his reflections without being pulled back into old patterns of seeking his approval. The relationship was not healed. Nothing could undo 33 years of damage in 6 months of letters. But something fragile was growing in the space between us, something that might eventually resemble genuine connection, if nurtured carefully over time. I maintained strict boundaries throughout this period. I monitored their progress through intermediaries and official reports rather than direct contact. I did not visit for holidays or call weekly to check in. The wounds were too deep for quick reconciliation, and I understood that proximity might trigger old dynamics that would undermine whatever growth was occurring. Distance allowed me to observe without being drawn back into the role of accommodating daughter, desperate for approval that might never come. 8 months after the Christmas dinner, sitting in my office reviewing quarterly reports, I received a message that made my blood run cold. It arrived through an anonymous channel untraceable by my security team's initial analysis. The sender claimed to be a former Masterson employee, someone who knew things about my family situation that should have been confidential. The message was brief and devastating. Your sister has not changed. She is planning something. Be careful. I stared at those words for a long time, feeling the old fear flickering back to life in my chest. The fear that I had been fooled again. The fear that Tracy's apparent transformation was just another manipulation more sophisticated than her previous attempts, but ultimately serving the same selfish ends. The fear that my hope for genuine reconciliation had blinded me to warning signs I should have recognized. Everything I had worked toward, every careful boundary I had established, every cautious hope I had allowed myself to feel, all of it suddenly seemed fragile and possibly illusory. I wondered if everything I had hoped for was about to collapse. I launched a discreet investigation into the anonymous message directing my security team to trace its origins while I reviewed every recent report about Tracy's behavior. What I discovered surprised me in ways I had not anticipated. The message came from a former employee Tracy had mistreated during her management tenure, someone who had filed one of the 14 harassment complaints and still carried understandable bitterness. This person had heard through industry connections that Tracy was working at a Masterson property and assumed the worst. The warning was not based on evidence of current scheming, but on the reasonable assumption that someone as cruel as Tracy had been could never truly change. But my investigation revealed something else. Tracy had recently discovered a financial error in her department's supply, ordering a mistake that could have cost thousands of dollars and gone entirely unnoticed if she had stayed silent. Instead, she reported it immediately to her supervisor, accepting the additional scrutiny that came with drawing attention to problems. She had also defended a young housekeeper from an unfair complaint lodged by a demanding guest, advocating for her colleague in a way that risked her own standing. Small acts. Quiet choices that no one was monitoring, and no one would have punished her for avoiding. Genuine ones. I flew to Arizona without announcing my visit. I found Tracy in the staff break room during her lunch period, sitting alone at a table near the window eating a sandwich and reading something on her phone. She wore the standard housekeeping uniform, her name badge reading simply, Tracy W. Housekeeping Team. No title, no status, just a name and a role. She looked up when I entered, her expression shifting through surprise and alarm before settling into something unexpected, a tired but genuine smile. "I was going to email you this week," she said, setting down her sandwich. "I wanted to tell you something." I sat across from her and waited. "I understand now," she continued, her voice carrying none of the performative emotion I had learned to recognize over decades. "Why you set these conditions. Why you made this so hard. I hated you for it, Danielle. For months I hated you every time I cleaned a bathroom or changed sheets or got on my knees to scrub floors." She paused, her eyes meeting mine directly. "But I think it is working." "It is. I think I'm becoming someone different. Someone I might actually be able to live with." Her next words came with difficulty, pushed out against resistance. I could see her fighting. "I am sorry. Not because you are powerful, not because you control my future, because I finally understand what I did to you, what I stole from you, what I was too selfish and afraid to see for 30 years. Later that day, back in my hotel room, I received a package forwarded from Walter's estate attorneys. Inside was a sealed envelope marked with instructions, to be delivered when Danielle has faced her family. I opened it with trembling hands. Walter's familiar handwriting filled the page words he had written, knowing he would not be present when I read them. "Danielle, if you are reading this, you have done the hardest thing, faced the people who hurt you. I want you to know I forgave your father years ago. Not for him, for me. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. You gave me purpose when I needed it most. Whatever you decide about your family, decide for yourself. Be free. Walter." 1 year after the Christmas dinner, I walked out of the Masterson Grand into a cold December evening. I paused at the entrance, breathing in the winter air, feeling it sharp and clean in my lungs. Behind me stood the empire I had built from nothing. Ahead stretched a future I controlled completely. My family was healing. Imperfectly. Slowly. With setbacks and struggles and no guarantee of success. But genuinely in ways I had never dared hope for. And I had finally released the weight I had carried for 33 years. I stepped into the winter night, the city lights glittering before me like scattered diamonds. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. Not from my past, but because of it. Everything they had tried to destroy in me had made me unstoppable. And that, I realized, was the greatest revenge of all. Not their suffering, my peace. Danielle Webb's story has come to an end, but its message will stay with you long after. Sometimes the people who are dismissed as worthless turn out to be the strongest of all. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is not making others suffer but finding peace within yourself. If this story touched your heart, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story from our channel. What do you think about Danielle's decision? If you were in her shoes, would you forgive your family or cut them off completely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly want to hear your opinions and your own experiences. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Your support means everything to us. See you in the next video.